The Dark Conspiracy of the Stranger. In 2016, Ali's parents had just moved to the West Coast, and she was driving there to visit them. Most of the journey was desolate, with only a few gas stations scattered along the long highway at certain intervals. As she continued her drive, her car suddenly showed signs of trouble. The fuel light started blinking, signaling a problem. Ali wasn't very knowledgeable about cars, and given the unreliable nature of her old vehicle, she wasn't surprised, but she was definitely worried. She spotted a gas station about 30 miles ahead and decided to keep driving. However, before she could reach it, her car completely broke down, leaving her stranded on the side of the road. With no cell service, Ali had no choice but to hitchhike, something she never thought she'd have to do. Ali stood by the roadside, just waiting. Every 15 minutes or so, a car would pass by, but none stopped. This went on for hours, probably until 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. After waiting for hours in the darkness, she finally saw the headlights of a pickup truck approaching. She assumed it would pass by like all the others, but to her surprise, it slowed down and pulled over. The truck stopped, and the driver was a gaunt man with a long, hollowed face and long black hair that looked slightly unkempt.
"Need a ride?"
he asked cheerfully, flashing a wide grin. Something about him made Ali deeply uncomfortable, but exhausted and desperate. She knew this might be her only chance to get out of there. So, she got into the back seat. As they drove, Ali felt it would be awkward not to make small talk. But before she could say anything, the man spoke first, introducing himself as Dave and explaining that he was just driving along the highway for fun. That struck Ali as strange. Ali was surprised that he hadn't even asked why she needed a ride. Then, cutting off her train of thought, he glanced at her in the mirror.
"You don't have a weapon on you, right? Just making sure I'm safe."
The question seemed odd, but Ali brushed it off. She watched the road pass by, and for the next 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. Her fear grew as they veered off the main highway onto a dirt road. As the truck rumbled down the rough path, a dilapidated farmhouse came into view. Suddenly, the truck came to a halt, and the man immediately opened his door and jumped out. His movements were practiced, too smooth, too confident. Ali flung the door open and bolted toward the tree line while he ran around the truck, chasing after her from behind. But as she ran deeper into the forest, it became so dark that she could only hear his footsteps. She could no longer see him. Ali's heart pounded as she held her breath, hiding behind the trees, trying not to be found. His footsteps grew closer. His eerie voice repeated over and over, taunting her.
"Come back. I'll take you where you need to go. I'm not trying to scare you."
That made it even worse, especially since she could no longer hear his footsteps. Ali knew she needed to find her way back to the road, so she quietly moved in the direction she hoped was right. As she stumbled deeper through the forest, she pulled out her phone and dimmed the screen. Miraculously, somehow, she had service. At that moment, Ali nearly cried from relief. She called 911 and asked them to trace her call so they could locate her. Luckily, Ali staggered back onto the main road, exhausted and terrified. Just as she thought she had reached safety, she saw 2 police officers waiting there. The officers searched the house and confirmed that it had been abandoned for years. However, there was no sign of the man or his truck. A few weeks later, at home, Ali started researching and found a local crime blog about disappearances along that same highway. She froze as she saw his face. He was the prime suspect. Authorities had arrested him after linking him to several other disappearances. Though Ali was safe, the experience haunted her, but she felt relieved she had escaped him. Haunting delivery trip. Lena was working for a food delivery platform on the weekends to earn extra money, juggling between her main job and side gig. It was past 9 p.m., with a light drizzle in the air. Lena started her shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After completing her first delivery, 20 minutes passed with no new orders. Then her phone rang with a new request. After picking up the order, Lena started driving. It was a quiet neighborhood, nothing unusual. As she approached a red light, she noticed a pickup truck pulling up beside her. Instinctively, she glanced over. The driver was leaning out of his window, staring directly at her car. When the light turned green, Lena stepped on the gas. She glanced in the rearview mirror. The pickup truck was now following at a distance. Lena tried to stay calm, but as she turned into the neighborhood, the pickup truck turned in as well. She thought maybe he lived there. Following the GPS, she arrived at the final street, but confusingly, it was a dead end. Lena hit the brakes, pulling over near the house she was supposed to deliver to. The pickup truck followed and parked right behind her. Lena sat there, trying to come up with a plan in case things took a bad turn. She wondered, what was this guy doing? Was he really following her? Lena glanced at her phone and saw a message from the customer. When will the food arrive? Could it be? Was he the customer? Lena felt trapped and helpless. Then, he stepped out of the truck, slowly approaching Lena's car. He stopped near the trunk, his face partially obscured by the shadows. Suddenly, he picked up a metal rod and smashed it against her rear windshield, shattering the glass. Instinctively, she slammed on the gas. He leaped onto the back of her car, trying to crawl through the shattered window. Lena swerved sharply, throwing him off the car. She sped away, hands trembling as she grabbed her phone to call the police. But he wasn't going to let her escape that easily. The pickup truck was right behind her again, its headlights shining blindingly into her rearview mirror, making Lena squint. Suddenly, the truck lunged forward, ramming into the back of her car. The impact made Lena swerve, pain shooting through her ribs. Lena pressed the gas pedal hard, but the rain had made the road slick. She had to maintain control to avoid a crash. Panic flooded her as he pulled up alongside her, rolled down his window, and grinned a twisted, eerie smile. Then, another hit. The back of her car crumpled, and she felt something warm trickling down. Her forehead, her head had been injured in the collision. Dazed, Lena slammed on the brakes. With no other choice, she grabbed her phone again and called 911 for help. Through the rain, she could see his silhouette stepping out of the truck. Desperate, Lena floored the gas pedal and drove blindly. But moments later, her car slammed into a tree. She fumbled for the door handle, struggling to get out before he reached her. From a distance, she could hear him screaming in frustration. Despite the pain, she forced herself to run, sprinting toward the forest at the roadside. Lena tripped. Her ankle twisted, sending pain shooting up her leg, rendering her unable to move. He was almost on top of her as she desperately tried to crawl toward the roadside. Lena turned to face him. He raised a crowbar, and she screamed, thinking this was the end. But then, police sirens pierced through the quiet rain. He froze, ready to flee, but it was too late. The police fired a taser, bringing him down. At last, he was caught. Lena's vision blurred as she slipped into unconsciousness. Paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. Relief flooded over her. The nightmare was finally over. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school, but as I walked home, the excitement of Friday lightened my mood. No school tomorrow. I could finally relax. As I approached my house, I noticed something odd. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left earlier that day for a business trip, so he must have been in a hurry and forgot to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stepped into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut. The quiet of the house greeted me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the entire place to myself made me feel free. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I was all set for a night of gaming and movies. Hours passed as I got lost in my game. The house was silent, except for the occasional sounds from the TV. I decided to grab a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The garage light was on again. I froze, a strange, eerie feeling creeping over me. Did I forget to turn it off? Or had my mom come back? But I didn't hear her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my steps growing heavier. The moment I stepped into the garage, I saw that every drawer in my dad's workshop area was open. His tools were scattered across the floor, as if someone had been frantically searching for something. But no one was there. I hurried back inside, locking the garage door behind me. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I started heading back to the living room, planning to watch TV and try to calm myself down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattling violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder and harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was eerie, too silent. I ran straight for the front door, my only thought being to escape. But as I entered the living room, I froze in my tracks. Someone was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped an axe tightly. It must have been taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified that he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going upstairs was not an option. I quietly turned back and headed for the back door, trying to stay calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried across to my neighbor's house. Panicked, I banged on their door until they let me in. I waited there, staring at my house from across the street, praying the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I pounded on my neighbor's door, and it felt like hours before Mr. Thompson finally opened it, his face etched with confusion. I told him everything that had happened. Mr. Thompson, a retired firefighter with a strong sense of duty, grabbed a flashlight and an old baseball bat. He assured me he would check the house and that everything would be fine. Reluctantly, I stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body was still shaking with fear. My anxiety grew as I watched, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, wielding my dad's axe, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, shining his flashlight across the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside. From across the street, his voice echoed faintly. "There's no one in there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I knew I still needed to stay cautious. As Mr. Thompson began walking back toward me, that gnawing sense of unease returned. Before I could voice my concern, a shadow moved behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the dark side of the house, the axe glinting faintly under the porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned, the man lunged at him. A fierce struggle broke out. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe coming dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear, as I watched the horrifying scene unfold. Each second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson managed a strong swing with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder roared in pain, But instead of retreating, he raised the axe, ready to strike. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson threw himself to the side, narrowly dodging the blow. In that brief moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson delivered another blow, knocking the man off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help. But before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens echoed in the air. He looked up at the sound of the sirens and, using his last ounce of strength, bolted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, gasping for air but still steady. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they subdued him. The man thrashed violently, growling like a wild animal, but the police swiftly restrained him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the entire scene unfold. Mr. Thompson approached me, clutching his side where he had been hit, but still managing a smile. "It's safe now," he said. I felt an overwhelming gratitude for being saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted was to forget. I sat down on the steps of Mr. Thompson's porch, my body trembling, watching the man sitting in the back of the police car as it drove away. It was over, but the image of the intruder's face, his crazed eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would stay with me. I would never forget how close I came to being caught in the grip of something truly evil. The delivery trip was trapped. Leo, a delivery driver working for Amazon, found himself trapped in an unimaginable situation. After a routine delivery took a dark turn, he was making his final delivery of the shift during a heavy thunderstorm. The rain made driving difficult, and he was unfamiliar with the area. The storm calmed slightly after 15 minutes of waiting. Leo glanced at the package on the passenger seat.
"Might as well get this over with,"
he sighed. After another 20 minutes of driving, his final destination appeared a strange two-story wooden house, standing alone in a desolate area. Leo parked, grabbed the package, and walked toward the house. He rang the doorbell and waited for the homeowner to respond. The house was completely dark, which made him uneasy. It would be unfortunate if no one was home. He waited, but there was no answer. He rang the doorbell again. Still nothing. Just as Leo turned to leave, he suddenly heard faint footsteps approaching the door. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, revealing a thin man with dark circles under his eyes. He just stood there, staring at Leo, without saying a word.
"Sorry for the delay. Here's your package,"
Leo said, handing it to the man. The man took the package and gave a strange smile. As Leo turned to leave, the man spoke.
"Would you like to join us for a birthday party?"
It was an odd request, so Leo politely declined, saying,
"Oh no, thanks. I have a long drive home, and it's already late."
The man began talking about how no one had shown up for his daughter's birthday, and how nice it would be if Leo could stay for a bit. Feeling guilty about the late delivery, and sorry for the child, Leo decided to stay for a little while. As Leo stepped inside, he noticed there was no electricity, only the faint glow of candles, creating an eerie atmosphere. He quietly followed the man, the house so silent that he could hear their footsteps on the wooden floor. They stopped in front of a door and entered a large room, but everything inside struck Leo as deeply unsettling. A large dining table sat in the center of the room, with several covered plates resting on it. Candles flickered, but there were no birthday decorations. This did not feel like a celebration at all. As Leo was glancing around, the man suddenly appeared behind him, shouting,
"Happy birthday!"
He then told Leo to sit down while he went to fetch his daughter. Leo reluctantly sat down, glancing around, but something in his mind kept telling him that he shouldn't be here. Yet, he couldn't leave just yet, so he decided to stay until they cut the birthday cake. 5 minutes passed, but the man never returned. Just as Leo decided to get up and look for him, he heard a strange whimpering sound coming from behind a locked door in the room. Leo slowly approached the door, straining to listen. Someone was whimpering in pain, but the voice was faint, as if they were on the brink of death. He tried turning the doorknob, but it was locked. Bending down, he peeked through the keyhole. What he saw made him freeze in shock. A man was tied to a chair, his body covered in wounds, barely clinging to life. His skin was marked with deep cuts. Leo staggered backward. He turned to run but froze as he heard a voice behind him.
Why the rush, buddy?
In the next instant, a sharp pain struck his head, and his vision blurred. Leo blacked out, only to wake up to a hauntingly cheerful rendition of Happy Birthday playing in the background. His head throbbed as he realized he was tied to a chair at the dining table. Sitting across from him was the same man from before. The man stood nearby, holding a covered plate in his hands, grinning.
Welcome to dinner.
Then, he moved from plate to plate, lifting the lids. What lay beneath was unsettling chunks of raw meat, grotesque and unrecognizable. Leo realized it had all been a lie. There was no daughter. This man was a psychopath, and this was how he hunted his victims. Leo screamed, begging for his life, but the man only chuckled coldly. The man picked up a saw from the floor and charged at Leo. Just as he raised it above his head, a loud explosion rang out. The man collapsed onto the floor as police gunfire struck him. Leo couldn't remember how they got him out of the house. Perhaps he had blacked out again. The horrifying truth came to light. The man was a deranged serial killer. The tied-up man was actually a detective who had uncovered the killer's identity and alerted authorities before he was captured. Leo suffered injuries, but he and the man who had tried to save him had both survived. The horror lingered in Leo's mind, especially the killer's final chilling words to the police. "I just have a different taste in food." His eerie smile was the last thing Leo wanted to remember. Elevator and warning from the 9th aisle floor. Michael was invited for an interview at a building, hoping this would be a fresh opportunity for him. But before he stepped into the elevator, he encountered something strange. A strange man, seemingly a security guard, stopped him and sternly warned.
Don't get off the elevator until it reaches the 9th floor,
He said in an odd tone, completely devoid of humor. There was something in his voice that sent chills down Michael's spine, as though he was hinting at something unseen.
Don't do anything foolish.
He added before walking away. Michael stood frozen for a moment, convincing himself it was just an absurd warning, yet he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. Michael stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 9th floor. A soft chime echoed in the elevator, announcing each floor through the intercom, as if trying to ease his tension. When the elevator stopped at the 5th floor, Michael sensed something unusual. The sliding doors revealed a receptionist sitting at a desk. She looked at him and smiled warmly.
Good morning, Michael.
She greeted, leaving Michael stunned. What surprised him was the way she addressed him, as though she had known him for a long time, even though they had never met before. She spoke about his personal life, even recounting intimate details Michael had never shared with anyone. Leaning forward, she added,
We know everything.
and then smiled in a cryptic way. The doors closed before he could respond, and the elevator shuddered as it ascended. When the elevator reached the 11th floor, the doors opened, and an elderly woman stepped inside. She glanced at Michael, then turned back to stare at the elevator buttons. She said firmly.
I want to go to the 2nd floor.
However, Michael objected, advising her against going there.
Nonsense.
Pressing the button for the 2nd floor herself. When the elevator doors opened, It revealed what looked like a decayed, damp cave with slick walls oozing black water that seemed alive. The faint flickering lights only added to the eerie atmosphere. Michael stepped back, avoiding eye contact with the woman, but she was unfazed, stepping out as though this was where she belonged. Then she turned back, smiled, and asked,
Aren't you coming?
Michael panicked, frantically pressing the close button on the elevator. The woman slowly walked into the darkness, as if vanishing into thin air. But things did not end there. As the doors were about to close, a shadowy figure suddenly appeared, stopping the elevator doors with a bony hand. It was a man in a black suit with glowing red eyes.
Where are you rushing off to?
Michael stepped back, trying to maintain distance.
I'm not planning to get off on this floor. I'm heading to the 9th floor.
Then the man spoke about offering him a lucrative deal if he stayed. Michael frowned, his instincts warning him that this was far from good.
I don't need anything from you.
Oh, but I think you'll change your mind.
The man said, stepping closer.
Trade your eyes for eternal peace. You won't have to see any horrors again. A life free from pain, free from fear.
Michael froze as he stared into the man's cold gaze and realized that he had no eyes, just deep, empty black sockets. Michael felt a fog enveloping his mind, and before he realized it, he was stepping forward. But just as his hand was about to touch, a sound echoed from afar, snapping Michael back to reality.
No, I don't want that. I'll face it on my own.
The man's demeanor changed suddenly. His smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, sharp glare. He moved quickly toward Michael, arms outstretched, as if to pull him out of the elevator. The man grabbed his collar, yanking him off balance. Michael felt his foot slip off the edge of the elevator, stepping halfway into the dark void of the 2nd floor. Michael grabbed the elevator railing and used all his strength to pull himself back. The man lost his balance and let go. Without wasting a second, Michael slammed the closed door button. The elevator doors slowly shut, leaving the man standing in the darkness with a twisted smile.
You can't run forever, Michael.
The elevator continued to ascend. The buttons for the lower floors gradually disappeared from the control panel. He tried pressing a button, but the elevator did not respond. Then the TV screen switched to live footage of Michael, lying on the elevator floor, wearing a strange and unsettling smile. In panic, the elevator filled with a distorted version of the song Happy Birthday. When the elevator suddenly stopped at the 9th floor, the doors opened to reveal what seemed to be a normal reception area. Michael hesitated. The warmth of the room seemed to beckon him, but something about it felt too perfect. Then she stood there, pressing something that resembled a control panel, before vanishing in the blink of an eye. At that moment, he began to realize that he had stepped into an invisible labyrinth. Everything around him became hazy, and the scene seemed to unfold in an endless loop. The elevator descended to the 1st floor where he had entered. As he stepped out, he felt a brief sense of relief, only to witness someone else stepping into the elevator. As the doors closed, Michael instinctively warned the woman.
Don't step out until you reach the 9th floor.
The door shut, and the elevator began its ascent once again. Mysterious guest at the gas station. Kevin, working at a local gas station, was accustomed to the quiet routine of the night shift. This time, he was covering for someone else, starting from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. He sat behind the counter as heavy rain poured outside, with a major storm looming. Most people seemed to be staying indoors. After sitting inside for an hour, Kevin put on a raincoat and went outside to tidy up and prepare for the approaching storm. As Kevin gathered the last few items, he noticed a man not too far from the gas station. The man was pacing along the roadside, soaked to the bone. It was unusual, though it seemed he might just be waiting for a ride. 2 hours later, thunder began rumbling in the distance, followed by strong winds and heavier rain that shook the building. Realizing the intensity, Kevin rushed to lock the doors and moved to the storage room for safety. About 30 minutes into the storm, it took him several moments to realize that someone was banging on the front door. He left the storage room to check. Someone was outside, looking in and pounding on the door repeatedly. It was a man, and Kevin quickly rushed to unlock the door, thinking the man was in trouble and needed help. The man was soaked. He rushed inside without saying a word and began pacing back and forth across the floor, leaving puddles of water in his wake. Kevin tried asking if he was okay or needed help, but the man just stared with a vacant, hollow expression. Kevin thought it best to stay cautious and alert. The situation became uncomfortable. As the man paced around, Kevin realized he might be dangerous and decided to observe him patiently. The man's drenched coat revealed patches of mud and scratches, and there was a faint metallic smell of blood. His hands showed large, dark bruises. A gut feeling told Kevin that this man might have been involved in some violent incident. His appearance and behavior raised alarm bells in Kevin's mind. Though uneasy, Kevin decided not to escalate the situation, hoping the man would eventually calm down or leave. But the tension only grew as the storm intensified, leaving Kevin to think about his next move. The man seemed oblivious to everything, pacing around and mumbling incoherently. Occasionally, he cast strange glances at Kevin whenever he reached for his phone. Kevin noticed mud on the man's shoes and realized it was clay. He was familiar with it because customers often tracked it in on rainy days. It was a specific type of clay found near a construction site a few miles away. Kevin decided to act.
Would you like some coffee?
He asked, keeping his tone calm. At first, the man hesitated, then gave a slight nod. Kevin poured a cup and handed it to him. The storm outside seemed to be subsiding. While the man was distracted, Kevin quickly scribbled a note under the counter that read, "Call the police," waiting for an opportunity. Luckily, a delivery driver passed by and entered the store. Kevin discreetly signaled to him and handed him the note along with an item. The driver glanced at the note and nodded at Kevin before leaving. The man's behavior became more erratic. He started mumbling to himself. Kevin sensed that the man was on the verge of losing control. The man grew agitated, complaining about a woman who wouldn't stop screaming and how he had to make her quiet. Kevin pieced it together. The missing woman he'd heard about recently could likely be his victim. Kevin used the storm to create a distraction. When lightning struck and the lights flickered, he toppled a stack of metal shelves, startling the man. Amid the chaos, Kevin grabbed a wrench to defend himself if necessary. The man stumbled, spilling his coffee, and Kevin used the confusion to edge closer to the exit. Moments later, red and blue lights reflected off the rain-splattered windows. The police had arrived, tipped off by the delivery driver. The man tried to flee, but was quickly subdued. Kevin led them to the construction site. He deduced from the man's mud-caked, clay-covered shoes. There, they found the missing woman alive, though bound and hidden in an abandoned shed. Relieved to see her taken to safety, Kevin stood in the rain, trembling. The storm had passed, but its horrors lingered. Kevin finished his shift in silence. Midnight flight. Due to his job, Lucas frequently traveled for business to meet clients. He was sitting alone at the airport, waiting for a late-night flight back to Sydney. The clock showed 1 a.m. The area where he was seated was almost deserted, except for a few scattered passengers. Lucas had his headphones on and was engrossed in his phone. The atmosphere felt strangely empty for such a usually busy airport. At that moment, a flight attendant, a woman in uniform with an eerie, unsettling smile, approached him and gently tapped him on the shoulder.
Sir, your flight is about to depart. I think you missed the announcement.
Lucas glanced around and realized he was the only one left in the waiting area. The elderly couple had already left, and there were no other passengers. His flight was scheduled for 1:30 am, but it was already 1:15 am. He quickly stood up and thanked her, surprised at how fast time had passed. Lucas got up and began following her. As they walked through the airport, he noticed something odd. She seemed to walk with an uneven gait. Then, he noticed a deep scar on her left leg, and her skin looked unusually pale. She led him onto the plane, and as he stepped inside, he was stunned to see that the entire plane was packed with passengers, none of whom he had noticed or seen in the waiting area. The atmosphere inside the plane was eerily silent, so much so that for a moment he thought no one was breathing. The passengers sat with their heads bowed, not talking, almost motionless. After boarding, she leaned close and whispered in his ear.
Please take your seat, sir.
If he had been alone, he might have screamed. The cold, chilling breath in her whisper made his ears feel frozen. Lucas went to his seat by the window. As he sat down, he noticed a thin man in formal attire seated next to him, but there was something off about his face. Lucas felt the plane was unusually cold, and soon, a foul stench began to permeate the air around him. Lucas fastened his seatbelt and waited for the plane to take off, but none of the other passengers moved or changed their behavior. They all remained silent and expressionless. He told the man next to him,
It's so cold in here.
The man didn't reply. He just sat there with his head bowed. Lucas thought maybe he was asleep or didn't want to talk. Then all the lights began flickering. Suddenly, the emergency alarm blared, and the plane started shaking violently. Lightning flashed across the sky outside. A violent jolt caused luggage to fall from the overhead compartments. He screamed, but the man next to him and everyone else showed no signs of panic. They all sat like statues, seemingly indifferent to what was happening. In a panic, Lucas tried to unbuckle his seatbelt, but it was stuck. Desperate, he shouted for help. Then, he turned to the man next to him, saying,
Excuse me, please wake up. This plane is going to crash. Please, we need to do something, or we're all going to die.
As Lucas struggled, the man next to him slowly looked up. His face was horrifying, with one side severely burned and scarred. He smiled, a chilling, terrifying grin, and said,
They're all dead.
The other passengers now revealed grotesque faces. A spine-chilling, sinister laughter erupted from all of them. They began laughing in unison, a shrill, terrifying sound. Please let me off, he begged. At that moment, his seatbelt came undone, and he ran toward the exit to escape. But the flight attendant suddenly appeared, blocking his path. Her face was now unrecognizable, her body covered in wounds, smeared with blood, and she had a wide, menacing grin. He shoved the flight attendant aside and ran toward the cockpit, hoping to find the pilots. When he opened the door, he was met with a horrifying sight. Both pilots were gone, and everything inside was engulfed in flames. His vision began to blur. His head throbbed, and the faint sound of devilish laughter echoed in his ears.
Sir, are you okay?
The voice startled Lucas awake. It was a security guard at the airport, leaning down to check on him. He slowly sat up, his body trembling, and looked around. He was no longer on the plane. Instead, Lucas was lying next to the charred wreckage of what looked like an old airplane. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and something worse. The guard told him that this area was restricted.
That plane had been struck by lightning a week ago, and everyone on board, including the flight attendants and pilots, had perished.
Shocked, Lucas stammered that he had been on that plane. He looked at the plane, horrified by what he had just experienced. He knew he had narrowly escaped the dark fate that had befallen the passengers of that ill-fated flight. The night at the airport. Kevin was always a hardworking guy, juggling a daytime job and night shifts at the airport to earn extra money. Partly, it was convenient because he lived nearby, making the commute easy. It was Kevin's first night shift. The terminal was eerily quiet when he arrived around 1 a.m. The airport manager handed him a set of keys, saying he would return around 4 a.m.
Do you have a flashlight?
The manager asked. Kevin nodded, assuring him he did, and began his tasks, mopping the floors, inspecting restrooms, and ensuring no pipes were leaking. Everything was so quiet that he could hear the echo of his own footsteps. While wiping down the counters, he glanced out at the silent runway. It was a familiar sight, but tonight, something felt different. Then he heard a woman's laughter from somewhere far away. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the sound was too distinct to ignore.
Is anyone there?
Kevin called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. There was no reply. Suddenly, the sound changed. It was no longer laughter, but heavy footsteps coming from the restroom area. He assumed it might be a homeless person who had snuck in. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness. He grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the source of the noise. The restroom was at the end of the terminal, and his unease grew with each step. He shone his flashlight into the room, but the only thing he saw was a woman with long black hair, standing with her back to him. He couldn't see her face because she was facing away.
Excuse me, ma'am. You can't be here.
Something was off. She seemed to vanish. He stepped closer, noting strangely that none of the stall doors were closed. Kevin waited a few seconds in the dark with his flashlight before deciding to check for himself. When he reached the last stall, the hair on his neck stood on end. There was no woman. Alone in the restroom, he splashed water on his face, trying to shake off the sleepiness and clear his head. Kevin went out to find the power switch to turn the lights back on, but he froze. On the floor he had just cleaned, there were now dark, blood-like footprints. Sweat began dripping down his forehead as fear took hold. He decided to call his manager, but when he pulled out his phone, there was no signal. The footprints led him to the far end of the airport, near a narrow hallway that descended into the basement. Just before Kevin reached the basement door, he heard something, a heavy, labored breathing. Someone was on the other side. From the darkness, he saw an eye, wide open, with a tiny black pupil staring at him through a crack. Kevin panicked, collapsing to the floor. He had never felt this kind of fear in his life. Suddenly, the eye blinked, and Kevin realized he was entirely alone in the airport. He remembered locking the doors after the manager left, meaning there was no way anyone else could have entered. So, who was on the other side of the door? Suddenly, a bony hand with skeletal fingers appeared through the crack and beckoned to Kevin. The terrifying eyeballs stared at him. The woman's laughter echoed once more, and then the basement door burst open. Kevin wanted nothing more than to stand and run as a spine-chilling scream erupted, shattering every glass window around him. Kevin shielded his face from the flying shards and began shouting for help. Then, a chilling gust of wind swept over him. He opened his eyes to see a terrifying woman staring directly at him, so close that Kevin could feel her icy breath on his skin. Her face was gaunt, with blood dripping from her head as she stared into him. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but only distorted moans escaped. Then everything faded to black. Later, he awoke to someone calling his name. Kevin found himself lying on the floor, with the manager helping him up. Looking around, everything seemed untouched. There were no footprints or broken doors. After leaving, Kevin learned he had passed out near the site where a woman had been assaulted by a dangerous man. The culprit had disguised himself as a janitor to hide in the airport. Perhaps Kevin's decision not to follow the ghost into the basement had saved his life. Secrets hidden in the basement. Leo, a college student desperate to find a job during his winter break, stumbled upon a strange ad on Craigslist. The ad lacked details, but the salary was too good to pass up for a simple housekeeping job at the home of an elderly woman named Mrs. Donovan. At the end of the ad, there was a phone number. An elderly woman answered the call and gave him an address to visit the next day. The next day, Leo arrived at Mrs. Donovan's house, a peculiar old wooden house surrounded by a vast garden of towering red roses. Their charcoal black stems stood out against the vibrant petals. Mrs. Donovan warmly welcomed him, an elderly woman with sharp gray eyes and an air of mystery. She gave him a tour of the large house, filled with books on botany and strange plants. Her library was vast, and there was something about those books that made him feel uneasy. Then she led Leo out to the garden, full of strange plants, especially the roses he had noticed earlier. She began praising the roses as the work of her life and gave him detailed instructions on how to care for the garden. Inside, she offered Leo a cup of coffee and instructed him on some tasks around the house while she was out. She said,
"Everything must be cared for as it is when I leave. Just tend to the plants. One rule, don't go into the basement."
At first, Leo found her expression a bit odd, though nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Many people have restrictions on certain rooms in their homes. His curiosity was piqued, but soon set aside. After Mrs. Donovan left, he spent the next few hours tending to the plants, ensuring each was watered and cared for properly. Leo took a deep breath and noticed something odd. The scent of the flowers was overpowering, almost metallic. Moreover, the rose petals were much thicker than a typical rose. Just then, a bee buzzed past Leo's head, startling him as he grabbed a rose. The red petals crumbled in his hand, but something was strange. His hand felt slick and sticky. Leo opened his palm. A thick red liquid oozed from the broken petals, staining his hand. It was unlike any flower Leo had ever seen. It looked like blood. Shuddering, Leo rushed back inside to wash his hands. Suddenly, he heard an echoing noise from the basement. It grew louder, like a cry for help. Despite Mrs. Donovan's strict instructions, curiosity and concern drove Leo to the basement door. He descended the stairs, the faint light from his phone illuminating a metal door hidden at the end of the hallway. A faint whimper sent chills down his spine. Something was terribly wrong behind that door. With trembling hands, he pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit room. Iron cages lined the walls. From one of them, he heard a faint plea for help.
Help me.
Then he saw her, a young woman curled up in the corner of a cage, her pale face covered in scratches, her body showing signs of severe malnutrition. Leo was shocked and horrified. The woman explained that Mrs. Donovan had kept her imprisoned and fed her body to her monstrous plants. Just as he began planning her rescue, he heard the front door open. Mrs. Donovan had returned unexpectedly. As she entered, dragging a large suitcase behind her, Leo tried to remain calm, pretending everything was normal. She squinted, tilting her head as she studied him.
"You look pale. Are you okay?"
Mrs. Donovan's smile vanished. Her gaze shifted toward the basement door, then back to Leo.
"You went somewhere you shouldn't have, didn't you?"
Mrs. Donovan suddenly grabbed a pruning knife from her suitcase and slashed at Leo. He dodged, the blade striking wood and splintering it. Leo shoved a chair forward, knocking her off balance, then sprinted toward the basement, slamming the door behind him and locking it with a rusty latch. Leo reached for his phone but realized it was missing. Panic surged within him. Then he remembered the landline phone in the kitchen. He needed to get there without being caught by Mrs. Donovan. Leo spotted a broom and an old coat in the corner of the basement. Quickly, he propped the broom against the wall, draped the coat over it to mimic a human figure, then grabbed a pipe from the floor and hurled it against the wall to create a loud noise. The distraction worked. As she stormed through the door, It gave Leo just enough time to slip into the kitchen. He dashed to the phone, grabbed the landline, and dialed 911 with trembling hands. She realized and quickly returned. Leo grabbed a pan from the counter and struck her arm, causing the knife to drop to the floor.
Help! She's trying to kill me.
Leo screamed into the phone, his voice desperate. Leo dodged, grabbed a bottle of fertilizer from the counter, and hurled it into her face. The powder temporarily blinded her, giving Leo a chance to grab the knife and point it at her. Her wild grin sent shivers down his spine. The front door burst open, and police stormed in. Mrs. Donovan lunged desperately at Leo, but the officers tackled her to the ground and restrained her. Shortly after, her garden was destroyed and burned to ashes by authorities. They uncovered the horrifying truth about Mrs. Donovan's experiments with carnivorous plants that thrived on blood and human flesh. The truth about her dark experiments was revealed. She was sent to a mental institution where she would spend the rest of her life. This nightmare was something Leo would never forget. The kidnapper's scary plan. Lily was on her way home from her best friend Emma's house. Emma's house was on a hill, and despite Emma urging Lily to stay over, she decided to head home. It was only 7:30 p.m., and she decided to take the bus. At the nearby bus stop, she arrived and saw a man already sitting there. He looked a bit strange, appearing to be homeless. The man's unsettling presence made Lily uncomfortable. She decided to keep her distance and stood there with a serious expression. Emma called her to ask if she had boarded the bus yet. Lily talked to her for a while, trying to ease the discomfort caused by the man's presence. Despite trying to ignore him, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. Every 5 to 10 seconds, he would take out his phone and appear busy texting. After ending the call, Lily glanced at her phone. It was 7:45 p.m., and her battery was down to 10%. She sighed, annoyed that she hadn't charged it earlier. She stared at the long, empty highway, but there was no sign of the bus. She felt uneasy being alone with the strange man. Then the man stood up from his seat and started walking toward Lily. She looked away, trying to focus on her phone screen as he approached her.
Hey, got a lighter?
Without looking up, Lily curtly replied.
I don't smoke.
She could hear him moving behind her, but didn't dare to turn around. A moment later, she turned around, and he was standing right in front of her. His eyes stared at her vacantly, and his smile was eerie, grotesque.
Are you sure? All girls pretend they don't like attention, but they all love it.
Leave me alone.
She yelled loudly, threatening that if he didn't back off, she would scream and call the police, warning him that her friend's house was nearby and her friend's dad owned a gun. His smile vanished, and she thought she was safe. Then headlights appeared as a car pulled up, driven by an older woman who offered Lily a ride. Surprised but not hesitating, Lily seized the chance to escape the unsettling situation. She quickly got into the car without a second thought, leaving the man behind. As the car drove away, Lily saw the man smiling in the rearview mirror, and his expression sent chills down her spine. They drove off, and the woman smiled as Lily thanked her. But her friendly demeanor seemed odd when she turned to Lily and said,
Women need to be careful these days. You never know when you'll walk into a trap.
The woman drove slowly along the dark highway. After a while, they stopped at a deserted gas station parking lot. Lily watched the woman step out and shut the car door behind her. Lily wanted to call her parents to let them know, but she remembered her phone was dead. Just then, a ringtone sounded, and her eyes fell on a phone lying casually on the dashboard. She thought the woman must have forgotten it. She cautiously reached out to grab it. The phone unlocked without needing a password. At that moment, a wave of dread washed over her. The phone's wallpaper flashed on the screen, showing a picture of the woman standing next to a man. He was the same man Lily had seen at the bus stop. Somehow, they were connected. Panicked, she quickly grabbed the phone and slipped out of the car, but not fast enough. The woman returned, her kind expression gone, blocking the door.
Where do you think you're going, girl?
Lily stumbled, slipping through the driver's side door to get out. As she escaped, the woman circled around the back of the car, brandishing a knife to block her path. The woman lunged at her, and instinctively, Lily raised her arm to shield herself, causing the blade to slice painfully across her skin. Lily turned to run, but the woman grabbed her hair and yanked her back. Lily screamed, twisting and clawing at her hand. Blood dripped down her arm, her strength fading from the injury. But then, a surge of survival instinct kicked in. Lily stomped and kicked at the woman's shin, making her stumble and giving Lily a brief chance to escape. As Lily sprinted toward the road, headlights appeared in the distance. It was a truck. Desperate, she waved frantically, hoping they would stop. The truck slowed down as they saw her. The woman stood just behind her and yelled,
She's stealing from me. Stop her.
A man stepped out. Lily could only cry out.
She's lying. She tried to kidnap me.
He hesitated, but the sight of Lily's bleeding arm seemed to convince him. She quickly got into his truck, and they headed to the police station. Luckily, she had evidence, her phone. It was a treasure trove of proof. They were kidnappers preying on women and children. They had a twisted scheme. The man would harass women, and the woman would pretend to be a savior. Once inside the car, the victim had no escape. Luckily, Lily avoided becoming their next victim. Months later, she still thought about that night. Since then, Lily had bought a car and vowed never to take public transportation alone at night again. The deadly farewell. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I walked through the sterile hallway of the hospital. I had worked here for years, the smell of antiseptic and the beeping of monitors ingrained in my senses. But lately, something felt different, something that always sent a chill down my spine. My patients came in all ages, but there was one little girl named Tira, perhaps the youngest patient in the hospital. Tira was a sweet child. She often wandered the halls and talked to other patients, though she was mostly alone. One night, while working a night shift, I was doing my rounds as usual. In the empty, long corridor, I heard two people talking softly. It was late, and all patients were supposed to be asleep. I followed the sound, which was coming from room 203. As I carefully opened the door to check, I saw her. Tira was standing near the patient's bed, smiling at me mysteriously and greeting me. But my sudden appearance didn't startle her at all. I reminded her that it was past bedtime and asked what she was doing there. She replied,
Nothing. I just came to say goodbye to George.
George was the patient in room 203. He had recently undergone major surgery. Though Tira seemed calm to me, I noticed George's face. He looked terrified and extremely pale. When I turned to remind her and take Tira back to her room, she had vanished as quickly as if she'd never been there. The next day, I went home around 4 a.m. after my night shift ended. It was my day off, so I slept the entire day. When I returned to work and walked past room 203, I thought about checking on George. But when I opened the door, I found a different patient, and I was informed that George had passed away the previous day. I stood frozen in the hallway, suddenly remembering when I asked Tira what she was doing in George's room. She said she came to say goodbye. But why goodbye? Shouldn't it have been good night? Something was very strange. Every time I encountered little Tira, I would find her wandering the empty hallways at night, talking to someone, or entering a room. At first, I was skeptical, but I noticed that her presence seemed to coincide with the moments just before a patient passed away. Could she possess the strange ability to know when someone was about to die? Then I searched the hospital records. Tira wasn't listed anywhere. There was no information about her being admitted, and no legal guardianship papers on file. I was stunned. I gradually became obsessed with Tira's story and started investigating her background. My suspicions grew when I learned from a nurse that Tira had died in the hospital just a few months ago after falling down the stairs. However, the nurse insisted the incident was ruled an accident, and the hospital never made it public. My mind reeled. How could Tira still be here if she was dead? I started piecing things together, and a chilling thought struck me. Perhaps Tira's spirit was still lingering here. One day, when I dozed off at my desk, I saw her. She was sitting, crying in my dream. I slowly approached Tira. Tira turned to face me, her pale face and empty eyes brimming with a profound sadness. She said,
"I've been waiting for you, Dr. Cooper. You're the only one who can help me."
I stood frozen, the air thick with fear, or perhaps confusion. I asked Tira,
Help you? Tell me how.
Tira's ghost stepped closer, her small hand reaching toward me. She whispered painfully,
The experiment killed me.
I jolted awake at my desk, drenched in sweat from what I had seen. It was too real, like a cry for help. I knew I needed to act. I dug through old records, my hands trembling. I found it, just a copy, a part of a plan I'd never seen before. It all seemed to point to a dark secret. The deeper I delved into Tira's past, the more I realized her death was no accident. In reality, it was the result of an illegal medical experiment involving an unapproved drug to test the limits of human pain endurance and survival. Tira was selected as a test subject due to the influence of her adoptive father, a man working at the hospital as part of an underground network of unethical experiments. The drug used on Tira was untested and had horrifying side effects. Tira's death was the culmination of a cover-up to protect the hospital's reputation. One night, while working the night shift at the hospital, I heard strange noises, like a child crying, coming from the abandoned wing of the hospital. The sounds led me down a hallway that hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded as I pushed open a door, revealing a forgotten room. Tira stood there, her figure faint in the dim light, her eyes filled with sadness and pain. She told me that she couldn't leave, and that she had been trapped in the hospital ever since her death. Her spirit was tethered to the hospital, bound to the hallways, unable to move on until the truth about her death was revealed. Tira had guided other souls to the afterlife, but she herself was trapped here. When I made my final efforts to reveal the truth, the hospital management and the girl's adoptive father tried to discredit me, even going to great lengths to silence me by threatening my career. The hallways were empty, the hospital eerily silent. I walked through them, knowing they were trying to stop me. But I didn't falter, and I was determined to report everything to the authorities, ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable. As the authorities investigated, I stood in a patient's room, moonlight streaming through the window. I saw the silhouette of a little girl standing behind me. It was Tira, appearing now in a more peaceful form. She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. She thanked me, her voice gentle, as her figure began to fade away. Tira's departure finally brought clarity. The hospital faced public outrage, and the administration was forced to shut down. Her adoptive father was arrested for his involvement in the illegal experiments, and justice was served. Although Tira's ghost was gone, the darkness of the hospital remained, reminding me that the line between life and death, between justice and illegality, is often much thinner than we imagine. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in dim streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store had closed, and the eerie silence surrounded it. Lena was the night shift manager. Usually, everything was quiet, nothing ever happened, and she would just stock shelves in the still hours while the world outside slept. Her focus broke when she heard a faint tapping. It came from the front of the store. Leaving her cart behind, she walked toward the noise. Through the large glass windows, she saw a man. Lena approached the glass door and asked what he wanted. He demanded she open the door. His face was blank, void of a smile, his cold eyes staring directly at her. Lena told him the store was closed, and he couldn't stay there. As Lena turned to leave, a loud bang made her jump. The man's fists pounded against the glass again, and again, each time harder and angrier. This guy wasn't just some harmless wanderer. She pulled out her phone, showing him she was ready to call the police. Only then did he step back, his glare still locked onto her, seething with rage. Slowly, he walked into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in her chest eased slightly. He was gone. She put her phone away and tried to refocus on work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, they all faded from her mind as she lost herself in stocking shelves. But then, she heard a metallic snap, like something being torn apart. She abandoned her cart and rushed forward, fear surging in her chest. Her stomach dropped as she saw the glass door cracked open. The lock, the only thing keeping it secure, was gone. Lena spun around, sprinting toward the office, but froze in place. Standing just a few feet away, blocking her path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still that cold, dead, furious stare. Lena didn't think she just ran. She burst through the door, the man right behind her. Suddenly, an old, battered van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting her as it came to a halt. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. Lena stepped forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped. A sharp, sudden pain exploded in the back of her head. Lena's body lurched forward, collapsing to the ground. She didn't even have time to process what had happened before everything faded into darkness. Lena woke up with a pounding headache, her wrists tightly bound behind her back. The truck bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. Her mind was hazy, disoriented. For a moment, she had no idea where she was. Lena started piecing it together. The man. The truck. Maybe she had been kidnapped. Lena knew she had to act quickly. She glanced around. The interior was pitch black. But then, she spotted a pile of old tools, a rusty toolbox, and a few scattered metal pieces on the floor. Lena twisted her wrists, testing the restraints. They were tight, but there was just enough slack to give her hope. She could hear him muttering to himself up front. This wasn't over. Lena took a deep breath, pushing down the rising panic. She needed to think. She needed to get out. Lena inched closer to the toolbox, searching for anything sharp. It was difficult, but she found a small metal shard. Awkwardly, Lena maneuvered her hands, rubbing the metal against the rope. Every pothole in the road sent jolts of pain through her, threatening to make her cry out and expose her escape attempt. Suddenly, she felt the rope loosen. A few more scrapes, and it snapped. Her wrists were free, but she couldn't move too fast. Lena glanced at the front seat, where she could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't noticed she was awake yet. She spotted the unlocked door. She needed a plan. The truck slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was her moment. Taking a deep breath, she yanked the back door open and leaped into the night. She hit the ground hard. pain shooting through her body as she tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a moment, she thought she wouldn't be able to move, but then the adrenaline kicked in. Lena staggered to her feet, sprinting into the dense darkness of the trees. Behind her, the old van screeched to a stop. She heard the man shouting, but she didn't look back. She just kept running. Branches scratched at her skin as she tore through the dense underbrush. Her mind teetered between fear and survival. She could hear the man coming. She couldn't let him catch her again. Ahead, she spotted a clearing and the faint glow of streetlights through the trees. A road. If she could reach it in time, she'd be safe. Lena burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving her arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded her, but she didn't care. She threw herself in front of the vehicle, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and she collapsed onto the pavement. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but Lena was too weak to respond. All she could do was whisper, "Help." The driver pulled out a phone and called the police. Through the haze of exhaustion, Lena could still make out the blurry figure of the man standing at the edge of the woods, staring at her with furious eyes. But he didn't come closer. Maybe he knew it was over. Lena was taken to the hospital after everything that had happened. She later learned that the man had been handcuffed not far from where she had collapsed. He had been caught. The police assured her he would be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. Though she was safe, the thought still haunted her. What if she hadn't escaped? What if she hadn't been fast enough? The fear lingered at the edges of her mind, but she was alive. She had survived the night. Rain pounded against the windshield as Mina drove down a desolate highway, her headlights barely cutting through the torrential downpour. She was a lone traveler, drawn to exploration and the thrill of discovering new places. Nights like this were familiar to her, driving down unfamiliar roads, seeking new experiences, when she saw a sign emerge from the darkness reading, "Welcome to Cottage City." A wave of relief washed over her. Mina continued driving, hoping the town would offer some respite from the storm. She drove slowly through the quiet streets. The town seemed frozen in time. A house caught her eye, a crumbling structure on the roadside, abandoned and eerie. Its walls were spray-painted with warnings like "Stay away," "Evil," and "Don't come back." Wooden crosses were haphazardly nailed to the porch and gate, as if someone had tried to ward off something inside. Curiosity got the best of her. Mina pulled over, stepped out into the rain, and switched on her flashlight. She stood outside, her flashlight illuminating the faded words. As she aimed the beam at the house, she froze. In the upstairs window, a young girl stood, staring down at her. Her face was pale, dark circles under her swollen red eyes, as if she hadn't slept in days. She didn't move, just watched Mina with a hollow gaze. Mina shivered and called out,
Hey, are you here alone? Do you need help?
She mentioned she was looking for a place to stay. The girl tilted her head, her expression unchanged, but her gaze seemed to pierce through Mina. She asked why Mina was here, and warned that she shouldn't have come. The girl then spoke.
Did you come to see her?
It was an unsettling question, one that sent a chill through Mina. She had assumed the place was abandoned. Mina asked why the girl was alone and where she was. The girl suddenly smiled, a twisted, eerie grin, and replied,
Her? She's waiting for a replacement.
The girl's eyes shifted past Mina, her face twisting into terror. A strong gust of wind howled through, rattling the doors of the old house. Then suddenly, a hand touched Mina from behind. Mina turned around to see an old woman standing behind her, holding a lantern. The confused expression on her face suggested she had no idea why Mina was standing in front of the abandoned house. Mina explained that she was just a traveler seeking shelter from the storm. She told the old woman about the little girl she had seen through the window, but the woman insisted it was only Mina's imagination. Mina learned that the nearest hotel was still an hour's drive away, and the woman offered her a place to stay overnight at her house. Mina accepted her invitation. It was hard for Mina to believe that the girl she had seen in the abandoned house was merely a figment of her imagination. Yet, Mina couldn't shake the feeling that this woman knew more than she was letting on. The house was as antique as its exterior suggested. The furniture was aged, the walls lined with dusty bookshelves and faded photographs. The woman, who introduced herself as Lena, led Mina to a seat near the fireplace. Gathering her courage, Mina asked Lena about the abandoned house. Lena told Mina that many years ago, she had moved here with her father. There weren't many children in the neighborhood, so she quickly befriended a little girl named Lily. Lily's family was large and lively, their house always filled with laughter. Lily's aunt, a warm and kind woman, always had candy for the children, especially for Lily. But one day, her aunt passed away suddenly. The entire family was grief-stricken, everyone except Lily. The little girl didn't shed a single tear, nor did she say a word. Lily just stood at her aunt's funeral, motionless, her eyes lifeless, even as they lowered her into the ground. Lily changed after that day, rarely going outside and spending hours alone in her room. Lily would stay in her room with her Ouija board. She said her aunt had taught her how to use it, and she would spend hours trying to speak to her. As Lena continued her story, Mina could almost picture the events unfolding. Something had changed in the little girl that day, something dark and frightening. Then, she continued telling Mina about what the little girl had gone through since that day. Right after the girl's aunt passed away, terrifying things began happening in that house. Around midnight, Lily's mother started hearing strange noises coming from her room. Scratching sounds, like fingernails scraping against the walls. Lily lay awake, eyes wide open, staring at something in the darkness. She felt a presence, something lurking beside her bed, watching her. Mrs. Lena leaned forward. She told Mina how Lily had confided in her older friend, saying she could feel eyes watching her every night, standing at the edge of her bed, silent yet terrifying. The next morning, Lily's mother checked her bed and discovered scratch marks on the mattress. Even more disturbingly, she found similar marks on Lily's own skin. Lily would scream, sometimes even laugh loudly in the middle of the night. Her voice would change, becoming rough, distorted, and filled with pain. Lily's mother rushed in, only to find her alone, trembling, her eyes filled with terror. The little girl spoke of them, shadowy figures. They would gather around her bed, staring with their hollow mouths, open in a silent scream. They all knew Lily was different. Everyone sensed that something had invaded her, but no one could stop it or help her. Mina shuddered as the old woman recounted the family's desperate decision to call for an exorcism. Lily's family summoned priests to perform an exorcism. Father Raymond was one of them, and he placed a crucifix under Lily's pillow, hoping to drive away whatever haunted the house. The ritual began, whispered Latin prayers filling the room. The exorcism turned chaotic. Lily writhed on the bed, growling like an animal, as if the crucifix was causing her unbearable pain. Objects flew across the room, and the crucifix seemed to burn her, sending her into a violent rage. Latin phrases poured from Lily's mouth, mixed with a hoarse, guttural laughter. Her body twisted in unnatural ways, eyes staring at something invisible. Father Raymond performed many exorcisms on Lily, and she endured tremendous suffering. During the exorcisms, Lily would roll and vomit, then break into uncontrollable laughter. That voice, it was like a demon disguised in a child's body, coming from the depths of darkness. Once, during an exorcism, Lily suddenly broke free from the priest's hold and lunged at the metal bed frame. She swung it wildly, slashing at the arm of one of the priests, forcing them to halt the ritual. On the night of the final exorcism, words appeared on Lily's body, as if an invisible force was carving them into her skin with a sharp blade. On the last night, 3 priests conducted the final exorcism on Lily, and they even witnessed her body levitating above the bed. As they recited the final incantation, Lily's body collapsed onto the bed, motionless. Everyone believed she had been freed. Lily's family moved away soon after, and no one ever saw her again. The people living near the house avoided it, cursing its existence. Some families even left the area due to the strange, unexplainable occurrences. She told Mina that some believed Lily's spirit never left, that she was still trapped inside the house. Mina shivered, recalling the grinning girl in the window, her eyes black and hollow. Mina shared what she had seen. Hesitantly, she mentioned that the girl looked no older than 14. The old woman slowly nodded and confirmed that was exactly Lily's age when she disappeared. Mina was frozen by what she heard. The woman pointed to a small room under the stairs, offering it as a place for her to sleep. She warned Mina once more to stay away from the exorcism house before heading upstairs. Lying on the bed, Mina stared at the ceiling, wide awake, unable to shake the image of the girl from her mind. She wondered, what if the woman hadn't arrived? Would she have been the next one, just as the girl had said? The sun finally rose, but the memories of the night clung to Mina. She thanked Lena and left, yet the questions remained. Did Lily die during the exorcism? Was her soul trapped forever, or had something darker consumed her? But one thing was certain, Mina would never return to Cottage City again. The final trip. Chris was always aware of the risks that came with being an Uber driver, especially working late at night. But when you're struggling to provide for your family, risk is just part of survival. That night at 10:30 p.m., Chris accepted a ride request from a quiet suburban neighborhood. The passenger was a man named Calvin. When Chris arrived, he saw the man wearing a hoodie, avoiding eye contact. He hesitated for a second, but brushed off the unease. He had picked up hundreds of passengers before. That was his first big mistake. Calvin got into the car with barely a word, pulling his hood lower to obscure his face. Calvin said nothing, staring out the window, making Chris uneasy. He tried not to think too much about it and focused on the road. But as the road stretched on and the streetlights grew sparse, his anxiety deepened. They were heading toward a more isolated area. Suddenly, Calvin leaned forward and pressed something cold and hard against the back of his neck. It was a gun. He growled,
"Take the next exit, and don't ask any questions."
Chris's breathing grew rapid, his knuckles turning white against the steering wheel.
I have kids,
He stammered.
Please, man, take whatever you want.
The car stopped in a deserted clearing. Calvin ordered Chris out. He shut off the phone and took the car keys. Desperation set in, but Chris refused to give up. The ground beneath him was wet and uneven. Cold sweat mixed with rain on his skin. Calvin pressed the gun into his back, motioning for him to walk toward the woods. At a clearing, he rifled through Chris's belongings, searching for anything valuable. He found some cash but grumbled that it wasn't enough before continuing to search. Chris saw his chance. With one swift motion, he pulled a can of pepper spray from his jacket pocket and sprayed it into Calvin's face. The man screamed in pain, stumbling backward and dropping the gun. Chris didn't hesitate, he ran as fast as he could. Branches tore at his skin, darkness making it impossible to see where he was going. But he didn't stop. It didn't matter anymore. Up ahead, Chris saw a light in the distance, a road, an escape. Behind him, Calvin had recovered.
You think you can run from me?
His voice echoed through the trees. Another mistake happened. Chris, too focused on looking back at his pursuer, tripped over a hidden rock and fell to the ground. Pain shot through his ankle. Before he could stand, Calvin grabbed his hair and yanked him back. Chris fought back, struggling against the grip.
Please don't kill me. I've given you everything I have.
But instead, Calvin slammed him against a tree. Racked with pain and hopelessness, Chris collapsed, his vision blurring. He wished for anyone to save him, but maybe this was his chance to save himself. As Calvin gasped for air, rubbing his eyes from the earlier attack, Chris slowly, silently reached for a rock. Without a second thought, with every ounce of strength left in him, Chris swung the rock hard against Calvin's head. Blood trickled down his face as he staggered. Though his ankle was nearly twisted, Chris sprinted toward the light he had seen earlier. A narrow stream trickled through the forest, making him pause for a moment. Chris waded through the water, knowing the stream would mask his footsteps and movement. The pain in his ankle was nothing compared to the terror of what would happen if Calvin caught him. Crawling through the brush, his body ached, but his will to survive burned stronger than ever. When he reached the road, utterly exhausted, Chris burst out of the trees, waving his arms frantically.
Help, please.
Headlights flooded the road, momentarily blinding him. A car screeched to a sudden stop. A woman immediately jumped out, rushing to his side and calling the police. That was the last thing Chris saw before his vision faded into exhaustion. Now safe, Chris was able to help authorities piece together the case against Calvin, leading to his arrest and trial. Despite his injuries, Chris was grateful he had survived. He would see his family again. The mysterious harmony from the ancient piano. Nee, a young woman in her early 20s, stepped into a small, dimly lit antique shop in a quiet neighborhood. The shop was cluttered with antiques, old books, worn furniture, dusty frames, and a few musical instruments scattered around. The air reeked of aged wood and forgotten memories. Nee walked past the counter where the shopkeeper stood. He stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes, as if he had been waiting. His face was gaunt, his skin pale. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was strange.
You found the piano. It's calling you. It will begin soon.
The word sent a chill down her spine, since she hadn't mentioned the piano. The atmosphere grew odd. She decided to look around briefly and leave quickly. Then, Nee's gaze landed on a piano, old and tucked away in the corner of the shop. Despite its age, its darkened wood seemed to exude a mysterious allure. She brushed her fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument's delicate beauty starkly contrasted its eerie presence, making it irresistible. She approached the counter to face the man again. This time, she noticed his hands were marked with faint, dark scars, as if burned or clawed repeatedly, the lines deep and jagged. She decided to take the piano and leave. The door chimed behind her, and she turned to see the shopkeeper standing at the window, staring at her unblinkingly as she walked away. From the moment she placed it in her room, strange things began to happen. Nee began to play the piano softly, trying to familiarize herself with its peculiar presence. The keys, though old, worked, but felt strange beneath her fingers. Suddenly, Nee stopped playing. The music lingered in the air for a moment before dissolving into faint whispers. She stood, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. One night, after a restless sleep, she returned to the piano. Nee found a yellowed sheet of music tucked among the piano strings. Curious yet uneasy, she played it, only to discover the notes resonated in an inexplicable way. It felt as though the notes were alive, playing themselves before her fingers touched the keys. Unintentionally, Nee had begun to unlock the tragic history of the piano's previous owner. She continued to play, unable to understand why she couldn't stop. She heard a faint voice whispering in her ear, speaking in ancient language. The words seemed to echo in her mind, filling her thoughts. She stood up abruptly, thinking she was probably too tired, and decided to head to her room and sleep. Nee drifted into slumber after a tense day. She was no longer in her room, but found herself in a grand concert hall. The room was empty, except for a grand piano at its center, and dim light from antique chandeliers that looked decades old. As Nee approached the piano, she saw a tall, gaunt man seated at the keys. He wore an old black suit, but his sunken eyes and pale skin made him look like a wax statue. Nee called out,
Who's there?
The man slowly turned around. His gaze pierced through Nee, and his voice echoed like a distant whisper.
I've waited a long time.
Nee tried to step back, but it felt like her feet were pinned to the floor. The man glided closer, not moving his legs, as if floating on air. Then the man pointed toward an old table nearby. On it lay a dusty sheet of music titled Sonata of Eternity.
There's not much time left. Only this melody can save us, or drown us both.
Before Nee could respond, the space around her twisted into a black vortex, engulfing her. She woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, clutching a corner of her blanket. Everything around her was silent. The dream not only left a haunting impression, but also led Nee to crucial details in reality. Perhaps she had unwittingly opened a door, allowing the spirits and tragic memories of the composer to resurface. She could still recall the image of the man struggling amidst the shadows, his eyes filled with despair, as if begging her to uncover the truth. She stopped playing the piano. For days, she couldn't bring herself to touch the instrument. Night after night, Nee heard whispers growing louder and more persistent, making everything feel increasingly unbearable.
Help me. Free me from the curse.
These words seemed to come from the trapped soul of the composer, still bound to the piano through his music. Waking in despair, Nee approached the piano, slowly sitting down. She noticed a small, faint mirror appearing behind the instrument. Nee cautiously wiped the dust from the mirror. Beneath the grime, the figure of a man slowly emerged. The gaunt man, his deep, dark eyes locked onto hers. He said nothing, but his gaze was intense, almost pleading, as if trying to convey something. After staring into the mirror, Nee saw words gradually appear on the glass. The crooked writing seemed as though someone was etching it from the other side. You have only one chance. Then his bony, emaciated hand reached out from the mirror, grasping toward her, begging for salvation. Understand the final rhythm before you play.
Please, help me. Save me.
A weight pressed against her chest before everything returned to normal. Nee realized she had to complete the sonata. The only way to break the curse was to finish the music she had started. She was plunged into despair and fear as she realized the price of freeing him. If she didn't play the final sonata, the curse would claim her as well. As Nee studied the sheet music, every note seemed distorted, warning her. It revealed the words, When the piano begins to play, you must finish the music before the light in the mirror fades. If not, the door will close forever. Nee swallowed hard, feeling the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Time was running out. It could happen at any moment. In her darkest hour, Nee sat before the piano, determined to break the curse. The clock struck midnight. The room was ice cold, and the music filled the air like an oppressive weight. Nee's fingers trembled as she began to play the sonata, the final piece in the composer's symphony of sorrow. But as she neared the final notes, Nee realized the sheet music was incomplete. A note had been erased, forcing her to rely on her intuition to finish the piece. She couldn't stop now. Then the mirror behind the piano shattered. Startled, she paused for half a second but couldn't stop. The gaunt figure of the man seemed to crack with the mirror, his eyes filled with despair.
Save me. Be careful. If you fail, you will take my place.
He cried out, his voice laced with agony. Ni played the final note, placing all her faith in her intuition. In the last moment of the sonata, the piano emitted a piercing sound. A brilliant light burst from the mirror, and she felt the entire room being drawn into the vortex. The man's figure vanished, and the room suddenly fell silent. In the ensuing silence, the figure in the mirror was gone, leaving behind a whispered,
"Thank you."
The room felt lighter, as if both their burdens had been lifted. When the light faded, Ni found herself sitting in her quiet room, all the strings of her instrument broken, and the mirror shattered. Exhausted, Ni collapsed on the piano. Perhaps everything was truly over, and fortunately, she had completed it. But deep down, Ni didn't know if she would ever truly escape the haunting melodies that had once drowned her. The ghosts in the fog. Tonight, like every other night, I drove my truck down a desolate rural road, taking a sip of coffee to stay awake. The road stretched ahead, cloaked in a thick fog that clung to my headlights. The stillness was eerie. No cars, no animals, just the hum of my engine and the faint crackle of the radio. I considered stopping to wait, but decided to keep going. Moving felt safer than sitting in the dark. A faint smell wafted in, like something metallic. At first, I thought it was just the engine, but it grew stronger, sour and rotten, mingled with the scent of decaying bone. It was stifling, worse than anything I'd ever smelled. I rolled up the window, but the stench lingered, filling the truck like a living thing. My stomach churned violently, and I pulled over to the side of the road. I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for fresh air, but the stench clung to me, lingering in the air. Unable to bear it any longer, I began vomiting. Once I was done, I quickly covered my nose as the smell still hung thick in the air. As I straightened up, I noticed movement ahead, a figure limping across the road, slow and deliberate. The figure was a man. He wore a torn white shirt and black trousers, the fabric old and frayed. I froze, watching him cross the road, oblivious to the faint presence of my truck. His head was slightly bowed, his face obscured by the fog. I climbed back into the cab, intending to approach him. As I drove closer, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, revealing more figures emerging from the fog. All dressed in old-fashioned clothing, moved disjointedly. They limped in unison, heads bowed. They didn't seem to notice me or each other, moving toward the darkness on the other side of the road. I kept driving. Then, from the same direction, a smaller figure appeared, a child, maybe in their early teens. The dense fog surrounded him as he stood motionless on the road, head bowed. Uneasy, I thought the boy might need help. I stopped the truck and stepped out once more. I approached him. "Do you need help?" I called, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. The boy didn't respond. Instead, his body remained unnaturally still, his head bowed like a puppet with its strings cut. A heavy silence blanketed the road. I swallowed hard and took another hesitant step forward. Suddenly, the boy's head snapped upward with a jerky motion, the crack of his neck loud enough to echo in the stillness. His face was pale and vacant. I stumbled backward as he tilted his head, as if studying me. Then an impossibly wide mouth opened, a gaping maw that hissed a single word.
"You won't escape!"
Before I could react, he lunged forward, his icy hands clamping around my leg like a vise. He tightened his grip further. I kicked desperately, trying to break free. Pain shot through me as my knee hit the road. I clawed at the ground, panic surging through me. With all my strength, I yanked my leg free and scrambled backward. My hands and knees burned from the sharp gravel, but I didn't care. All I could think about was escaping. The boy stood and started running toward me, his arms flailing and legs bent at unnatural angles. I stumbled toward the truck, with him right behind me. I dove into the cab and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock. His scream was deafening, shaking the truck's windows. His grotesque face, with its gaping mouth, pressed against the windshield. His hands slammed against the glass, leaving smears of something dark and viscous. Trembling, I turned the key and slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, throwing him off the hood. His twisted body writhed as he stood back up. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the road, surrounded by other nameless figures emerging from the fog. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the fog growing thicker. They stood motionless, watching as my truck sped into the darkness. The road stretched ahead through thick fog. I couldn't stop thinking about the faceless figures I'd seen before. Days had passed since I escaped the boy in the fog. Their hollow presence, the way they lunged toward me. It felt like they were still out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting for me. But I couldn't turn back. My delivery had to be made, and this was the only road. Then that smell hit me again faintly at first. Metallic, but quickly turning into a stench. Sharp and rancid, like rotting meat. My stomach twisted as I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it was no use. Ahead, my dim headlights illuminated an old sign by the roadside. It swayed lightly in the wind, its paint cracked and faded. Danger, though at the time, I had no idea of its significance. My headlights flickered briefly, catching the silhouette of a figure in the distance. I slowed the truck, squinting to see the figure more clearly. It was a man, limping across the road, his form distorted by the fog. I hesitated, unsure whether to stop. Then another figure appeared, and another. All of them moved in the same direction, heads bowed, their movements unnervingly stiff. I continued driving slowly, keeping my distance. The figures kept crossing, oblivious to my truck, disappearing into the fog on the other side. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Just people," I muttered, trying to calm myself. "Just people." Then my tires hit something wet and slippery, causing the truck to swerve. I slammed on the brakes, and then I saw it. A black, wet streak stretched across the asphalt. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing air biting at my skin. The stench hit me, a wave of nausea roiling my stomach. Ahead, the trail led to the carcass of an animal, its body decayed and rotting. Flies buzzed frantically around it, staining the road with wide, dark streaks. I was about to leave, but then something caught my attention farther down the road, shapes moving in the fog. A group of people stood by the roadside. Their movements were strange, unnatural. The next sound that reached me was growling, and perhaps chewing, as if they were gnawing on something. The fog thinned enough for me to see them clearly. I didn't know what they were, but they resembled the things I had seen before, only much more terrifying. Horrifying hollow cavities gaped on their faces and bodies, oozing a black, tar-like fluid. Some of them hunched over another animal carcass, gnawing on its remains with clawed, deformed hands. My gasping breath broke the silence. Then their movements suddenly slowed to a halt. For a moment, I froze, and the others followed suit, all raising their heads in unison. They were looking at me. Then they began running, charging toward me. Their bodies twisted and contorted, their growls morphing into frenzied screams. They were faster than I imagined. I stumbled, fumbling for my keys as I turned back toward the truck. The keys slipped from my hand and fell. I was only a few steps from the truck when something grabbed my leg. I fell hard, hitting the ground. One of them had grabbed my leg. My foot was slick with its slimy grip. In a moment of desperate panic, I twisted and kicked with all my strength to break free. I staggered to my feet and bolted for the truck. I slammed on the gas, speeding away from those grotesque creatures. I didn't stop. My hands ached. The road stretched ahead, silent. In the rearview mirror, all that remained was an empty highway. I swore I would never take that road again. I silently thanked whatever force had kept me alive. Mysterious driver in the desert. Gavi was driving down an empty desert highway, stretching for miles, barren and silent. He had been driving for hours. The only sound was the crackling of his car's radio, which seemed to be breaking down, with only static and the occasional country tune. This was one of the rare times Gavi passed through here. He glanced at his dashboard map. No towns, no gas stations for miles. Just an empty, desolate road. As Gavi approached a small hill on the road, he felt a sense of relief. The slight slope broke the endless flatness, providing a brief change. But as he went downhill, something caught his attention in the distance. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. Just a shape, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight. But as he got closer, the figure took form a person standing on the side of the road. Gavi slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. She wore a long white dress and had pale skin. Her long black hair hung over her face as if soaked in water. Gavi muttered, wondering what she was doing out here. There was nothing for miles. No cars, no houses. How did she even get here? Gavi slowed the car further, considering whether to stop. Maybe she was lost. But as he got closer, something sent a chill down his spine. Her hair looked too wet, as if she had just walked out of a rainstorm, even though the desert had been dry for weeks. And her face, what little he could see of it, her eyes were too large, unblinking, staring straight at Gavi through the wet strands of hair. He hit the gas, speeding past her in fear. Even though he tried to convince himself she was just a lost traveler or perhaps a prank, Gavi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Minutes passed, and Gavi continued driving through the endless desert, the eerie calm returning. He kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, feeling as if someone was watching him. He shook his head, trying to stay focused, but then Gavi saw another hill in the distance, just like the one he had passed earlier. And after a short drive, there she was again. The same woman, the same white dress, the same wet hair covering her face. But this time, she was closer to the road, and her smile was even wider, more unnatural. Gavi couldn't believe his eyes. How could she have gotten here before him? There was no way she could have moved that fast. He didn't think twice and slammed his foot on the gas, speeding forward to get past her. This time, Gavi didn't dare look back. Another hill appeared ahead, and the familiar fear tightened in Gavi's chest. He didn't want to go over it, didn't want to see her again, but he had no choice. His worst fear came true. She was there again, standing and waving at him. Her smile now impossibly wide, stretching nearly from ear to ear, and her cold, soulless eyes stared directly at Gavi. Maybe she was some sort of hallucination conjured by his imagination. No matter how much he tried, the fear continued to gnaw at him. He had heard the stories of haunted highways, of strange ghosts appearing to night travelers, but he had never believed them until now. He couldn't keep driving and needed to stop to escape this cursed road. But there was no exit, no rest stop. Gavi felt trapped with no way out. And then, the radio started crackling again. He reached out with a trembling hand to adjust the dial. But before he could turn it off, Gavi felt something cold touch the back of his neck. He froze. Reaching from behind the driver's seat was a pair of pale white hands. The fingers wrapped around his face, slowly digging their nails into his skin. Gavi was now about to face something he didn't understand. and he still had a secret he was hiding. Mysterious driver in the desert. Those fingers, they were slowly tightening around Gavi's face. They were icy cold. Cold like the touch of death itself. He was frozen in place. Slowly, with fear creeping down his spine, he turned to look. Gavi couldn't see the face those hands belonged to, but he had the sense it was a woman. Was it the woman? The one he'd passed many times on the highway? His mind was flooded with horror. The car swerved violently as the grip on him tightened. The tires screeched against the road. The car was losing control. The car veered off the highway, crashing into the rocky terrain with a sharp, grating sound. The impact was brutal, throwing him against the steering wheel as the airbag deployed. Pain surged through his body. Gavi's head hit the window, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. Smoke rose from the crumpled hood, the headlights flickering dimly on the dark horizon. Gavi's vision swam as he tried to focus. He was still alive. Gavi could feel blood trickling down one side of his face. His limbs were heavy, weighed down. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Then, he blacked out. In the distance, a car approached. The officer, a seasoned man who had seen his share of accidents, stepped out of his vehicle, his flashlight cutting through the desert's dark night. The car was a wreck. Twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the rocky ground. Smoke still rose from the engine. The officer cautiously approached. The officer, Jay, shone his flashlight through the driver's side window. His eyes widened in shock when he saw the body still strapped into the seatbelt. After checking the license plate, he realized it was someone named Gavi. His head was twisted at a strange angle, almost wrenched to the side, and his eyes wouldn't close, wide open as if staring right at me. His face frozen in a horrifying grimace, blood smeared across his skin. But just as Jay started to step back, he heard something. A sound like someone crying, but it was muffled, as if something was blocking their mouth. The sound came from the trunk. At first, it was faint, barely audible. But as Jay leaned in to investigate, it grew louder, more desperate. It was a sobbing, painful cry, like that of a child trapped inside. Panic surged through the officer as he ran to the back of the car. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the trunk latch. Jay's mind raced with questions. Who could be inside? What had happened? 2 cases at once? The trunk lid sprang open. Jay's flashlight illuminated a haunting sight inside the cramped trunk, a little girl. A young girl, bound and gagged. Her wrists and ankles were tied tightly with thick, rough rope, and her mouth was sealed with tape. Tears streamed down her pale face, her eyes wide with fear. Not just that clutched tightly to her chest was a doll. The doll wore a white dress, its skin pale and cracked with age, its face fixed in a disturbingly wide smile. Large, dark eyes stared back, and its long black hair appeared wet, hanging loose. Jay reached out to touch the doll, and then its head moved. The girl sobbed, her body trembling as she clung to the doll. Jay staggered back, the weight of the doll's gaze pressing on him. He turned away, his breath becoming ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer fought back his rising panic. It was just a coincidence, he told himself. He quickly untied the girl and removed the tape from her mouth. She gasped for air, sobbing loudly. Jay reassured the girl and led her to his patrol car. He called for backup. From the moment they got into the car, the doll sat there, staring at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, studying him with its eerie and unsettling gaze. Soon after, backup and paramedics arrived. The girl was taken to the hospital, still clutching the doll, which baffled him. Her small hands clung to it as if it were the only thing tethering her. As the ambulance drove away, Jay remained haunted by the strange presence of the doll. He pondered the mysterious events leading up to the crash. Even though the girl had been rescued, the story felt far from over. It seemed to have slipped beyond Jay's understanding, perhaps into another world entirely. Horrible night train ride. It was a cold autumn evening, and the train station was nearly deserted. The dim streetlights flickered in the distance as I hurried through the empty streets. I had walked for 30 minutes from my university and was about to catch the 9 p.m. train. I ran to the platform just in time as the train stopped in front of me. I stepped inside, glancing at the empty train cars. It was always quiet at this hour of the night, with only a few passengers. I found an empty seat by the window and sat down. I opened my notebook to review my lecture notes. The train gently rumbled as it pulled away from the station. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks was soothing, almost enough to drown out the unease gnawing at me. I looked around the train car and was surprised to see another passenger. A girl was sitting a few rows away, her head bowed, her face hidden by long, dark hair. I hadn't noticed her when I first boarded. She didn't move, just sat there, completely still. Something about her posture made me uneasy. She was hunched over as if staring intently at something at her feet, but I couldn't see what. I tried to focus on my notes, but my mind kept drifting back to her. She had been sitting still for a long time. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling sound. I looked up. She was no longer in her seat. Now she was right in front of me. I found it strange because I hadn't seen her move at all. A moment ago, she had been several rows away, and now here she was, her pale face directly in front of me. Her skin was almost ghostly white, and her eyes were wide, black, and empty, staring at me without blinking. Then she smiled, a smile that made me jump in fear. She began to speak, her voice soft, whispering, and strange. She greeted me and introduced herself as Jan. She then asked for my name. For a moment, my throat went dry, and I couldn't speak. I hesitated, stammering my name. Her smile grew wider, and she tilted her head slightly as if studying me.
Nice to meet you, T.
Her eyes never blinked, just stared straight into me. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but I tried to remain calm. I told myself she was just a strange student, maybe someone a little socially awkward. After an awkward silence, she finally spoke. She asked me if I had noticed anything strange and why this train was so empty. Then, with a curious tone, she asked if I had heard the rumors. My heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer, whispering,
People have gone missing on this train. Everyone at school knows about it. That's why I usually don't take this train. But tonight, I had no choice.
Her words sent chills down my spine. I hadn't heard any rumors, but the way she said it, the intensity in her eyes, it gave me goosebumps. I forced a smile, trying to break the tension. I had never heard that story before. I glanced around the empty train car. The train kept moving, the world outside darkening. Suddenly, Jan's expression changed. She froze, her eyes wide as she whispered, trembling, asking if I could hear something. I frowned, straining my ears to listen. I listened harder, but all I could hear was the sound of the train on the tracks and the engine. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her face creased with fear.
It's getting louder,
she said.
Listen carefully.
I just wanted to ignore her, to dismiss whatever she was saying. Then, I saw it. A shadowy figure, flickering in and out of view, running alongside the train, its limbs long and distorted. It moved unnaturally fast. I asked what it was, but she didn't answer, her face pale with fear. She whispered,
It's coming.
The train shook. The lights flickered for a moment. I jumped, gripping the edge of my seat. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, Jan was gone. I blinked, my mind reeling. How could she have disappeared like that? I stood up, looking around the car, but there was no sign of her. The train began to slow down. The door slid open, and a thick darkness enveloped me. I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. And then I felt a cold hand gripping my shoulder. Horrible night train ride. From behind, I felt an icy hand gripping tightly on my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the cold fingers tightened. Slowly, I turned my head, but there was no one there. I staggered back out of the compartment, my body shaking as I looked around frantically. The train was still there, silent and motionless on the tracks. I don't know where I am. The only light comes from the flickering light of the train window. I started walking along the length of the train, hoping to find some clue about where we had stopped. My footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel. Then, I heard a faint rustling noise behind me. Instinct told me to run, but I didn't know where to go. My only option was to go back inside. I couldn't stay out here, but the thought of stepping back into that strange train filled me with fear. Still, I had no other choice. Stepping inside, the air felt heavier, more stifling than before. The dim lights flickered weakly, casting shadows over the empty seats. In the distance, near the end of the train car, there was a figure sitting motionless, head bowed, just like the girl Jan I had met. I knew I shouldn't approach, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward her. I called out, my voice trembling, "Jan?" I stopped a few feet away, staring at the figure. Her hair hung limply over her face, wet and dripping, as if she had just emerged from a pool of water. I stepped closer, intending to touch her, calling Jan again. She didn't respond. Then, she finally moved. She slowly turned her head toward me, her movements unnaturally stiff, jerking like a robot. My breath caught in my throat as her face came into view. Her eyes, once dark and intense, were now completely empty, like black voids staring right through me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips curled into that same strange smile as before. There was a faint hissing sound, perhaps coming from her. Before I could react, she stood up, her body rising off the ground, floating. Her feet no longer touched the floor. She hovered just above it, her long hair flowing in the air. I was frozen in place, horrified as Jan's form began to change, her body stretching and distorting. It was something I had never seen in real life. A voice echoed through the train car, coming from everywhere, surrounding me.
Why did you come back? Why are you here?
My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. I needed to get out and leave. But when I turned to run, I felt something cold and invisible pressing against my chest. I moved like a puppet, being forced back into the seat. The lights flickered violently, casting wild, shaking shadows as if the train had come alive. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Silence filled the air. I looked up, and there was Jan, floating, her long, translucent fingers reaching toward my face. She told me to come with her, that I could never leave. The cold radiated from her, seeping into my bones, freezing me. Her fingers brushed against my skin, and in that moment, I was no longer on the train. I was floating in an empty void, with nothing but the sound of my own panicked breathing. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was trapped. Then, from the darkness, I saw them other figures, floating, drifting. Their forms were distorted, their faces obscured, and their eyes were empty. I couldn't breathe. Was this what happened to the missing passengers? Had they been brought here, into this void, to become part of this nightmare? And was I next? Suddenly, with a violent jerk, I was thrown back into reality. I was in my seat again, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. Jan was gone. The train began to slow down, the familiar sound of the tracks returning. Finally, the train stopped at the station. The doors slid open, revealing an empty platform bathed in dim, flickering light. I staggered off the train, my legs weak and unsteady after what had happened. The doors closed, and as I turned back to look, the train began to move again, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know if it was truly over. I stood there for a long time, staring into the void where the train had vanished. Stranger on the way home. I was driving home on a quiet, deserted road, my headlights cutting through the thick darkness. A familiar road I had traveled countless times. I was still about 10 minutes away from home when my car began to slow down. Confused, I pressed the gas pedal, but the car continued to lose speed. Panic set in as I realized the problem I had run out of gas. I suddenly remembered the low fuel warning light had come on, but I had forgotten about it, and in my rush, I had completely missed stopping to refuel. My car stalled, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I stepped out of the car, the chilly night air biting at my skin. Glancing at my phone, I saw the worst: no signal. I wasn't surprised. This road had no reception. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. It was nearly midnight, and there was no point in calling anyone. My friends were likely already asleep. I knew the area well enough to remember a gas station about a mile away. It would take 20 minutes to walk, maybe less, and the weather was fairly mild. So I decided I would make the quick trip. I grabbed an empty gas can I kept in the back of my car for my lawnmower. At least luck was on my side in some small way. There were no streetlights, only dense forests on either side. The road was eerily quiet. Only one or two cars passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the empty road before vanishing into the night. As I walked, my footsteps crunched on the gravel by the roadside. Every sound seemed amplified by the stillness. I felt a bit uneasy, but I kept walking. Then, I heard it. It was the sound of a car engine behind me. I stopped and turned around. A pickup truck was slowly approaching the spot where my car had broken down. My first thought was that they might stop to help, and for a brief moment, I considered asking for a ride. But then I saw them, 2 men. They got out of the truck, their faces quickly obscured by black masks pulled over their heads. One of them shined a phone flashlight into the window, while the other knocked on the door. They tried to open it, but of course, the doors were locked. I crouched down and moved closer to the edge of the forest, hiding in the shadows. Maybe they hadn't seen me yet, but they were rummaging through my car. Panic rose in me when one of them turned and looked in my direction. Suddenly, he started walking toward me. I froze. The other man got back in the truck, and I heard the engine roar as it sped forward, heading straight for me. I didn't have time to think. I sprinted into the forest. Behind me, I could hear the man crashing through the undergrowth, chasing me. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch me. In what felt like an eternity, I ran through the edge of the forest, dodging trees and leaping over fallen logs. After a few minutes, I saw a large, isolated house ahead of me. I ran behind the house, pressing myself against the rough, cold brick wall. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my ears straining to hear any sound of pursuit. I crouched there for a few minutes. Finally, I dared to move, cautiously slipping through the backyard toward the old path. I didn't want to knock on the door because it was too late, and I didn't want to cause them any alarm. I walked on high alert, every sound making me shiver. I looked around the area. No truck, no sign of the men. I continued walking toward the gas station. Another car came, and without thinking, I rushed back into the forest, hiding until the sound of the engine faded away. Finally, the gas station appeared in front of me. I felt relief as I filled up the gas canister. When I finally made it back to my car, I shakily poured the gas into the tank. I drove straight home, too scared to look back. As I sat in the safety of my own home, I couldn't shake the thought of those men, and I realized how lucky I was to have made it home safely. Pharmacy obsession. It was a quiet evening. Lily had been working as a pharmacy technician for a few years. It was a simple job, filling prescriptions and dispensing medications. The pharmacy had its regular customers. Some were friendly, while others were a bit odd, but everyone got used to them. Joe was one of those regulars, a man in his mid-30s who came by often. He stood out with his long, disheveled hair and eccentric clothing. Lily had seen Joe and his elderly mother many times. She was always his caretaker, bringing Joe in to get his medication. The mix of drugs he needed included antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, and a type of medicine for infectious diseases. Joe always complimented Lily and called her Kitty because she wore a pink bow hair clip. It was harmless, though strange. Lily would politely smile, chat, and give him his medication. He never made her feel unsafe. One day, Joe's mother came alone. She looked tired, older than before. She told them that Joe wasn't well. He had stopped taking his antipsychotic medication and was becoming unpredictable, sometimes even aggressive. She could no longer control him. The court had declared Joe unfit to make decisions, so he was admitted to a mental health facility. Lily felt a bit sad, missing the familiar face, but relieved knowing Joe was being taken care of. For months, they didn't see Joe. The facility's staff regularly picked up his prescriptions, and life at the pharmacy went on as usual. Then, one Friday night, everything changed. It was late. Only she and another female colleague were working. The store was quiet, as it often was on Friday nights. Lily was reading a magazine at the counter. Then, she heard a voice.
"Hey, Kitty."
At first, she didn't look up. After all, she wasn't Kitty, and she figured someone in the store was talking. But then the voice came again, angrier this time.
"Kitty!"
Suddenly, a bloodied hand slammed onto the counter in front of Lily, startling her. It was Joe, but something was wrong. He was bleeding heavily. The counter was smeared with Joe's bloody handprint. His face was pale, his eyes wild, like he had lost his mind. Her heart raced, and she slowly backed away from him. Lily's colleague, Jane, hurried over, concerned, asking what Joe was doing there since his medication had already been picked up on Tuesday. Joe didn't answer. He just kept staring at Lily, his voice soft but filled with dangerous intensity. He said he wanted to see Kitty and that he missed her. He started moving toward the waist-high door that separated the pharmacy counter from the rest of the store. Panic rose in Lily. Jane tried to calm him down, but Joe kept repeating the same demand, saying he wanted to see Kitty and telling Lily to come closer. She shook her head, fear rising inside her. She refused Joe, saying she couldn't come closer, but he didn't stop, beginning to cry and then scream. He started climbing over the counter, his bloody hands gripping the edge, leaving deep red stains on the white surface. Jane realized things were getting out of control and told Lily to hide in the storage room. Lily slammed the door shut and locked it, listening as Joe's voice turned into full-blown screams. He was throwing things all over the store in a frenzy, grabbing whatever he could reach. Blood spattered over bottles and shelves. Jane called the store manager and quickly phoned the police. Through the crack of the door, Lily could see the chaos. A few customers had gathered, staring in shock. One of them moved as if they were about to intervene. Both Lily and Jane shouted together,
Don't touch him!
because Joe had an infectious disease, and his blood was everywhere. Anyone who touched him would be at risk of infection. The police arrived quickly, but didn't rush in. They were wearing full protective gear, gloves, masks, and all because of Joe's blood. They cautiously approached him. At first, he resisted, screaming for Lily. But finally, the police managed to sneak behind him and sedate him. Joe collapsed to the floor, unconscious, and his bloody rampage was over. The store had to be closed. A specialized cleaning crew came to disinfect everything. A few days later, after the store reopened, Joe's mother came by to apologize. Joe was then transferred to a higher security facility where he would be more closely monitored. The smell of blood and the fear still lingered in Lily's memory. She hadn't seen Joe since that night. She heard that Joe's mother had considered suing the care facility for negligence, but she didn't follow up on what happened next. She just continued her work, but she would never forget him. The outcome of the Hitchhiker Man. I was working the third shift at a 24/7 diner in a quiet town. Most of our customers were truck drivers and travelers passing through. But the strangest people I've ever met were the drifters, addicts, and hitchhikers. That night started like any other. Carl, the cook, had been working at this place for over 15 years, and he had seen it all. His sharp eyes could spot trouble from a mile away. We were perfectly in sync. I served tables, and he flipped burgers. With a new cast in the pipeline, and he flipped burgers. Around 4 a.m., the shift was well underway. The place was completely silent, not a single person in sight. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of the old refrigerator. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A man stumbled in, clutching his right arm to his chest. He didn't say a word, just shuffled past Carl and me, heading straight to the bathroom. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his face was twisted in pain. Carl and I exchanged glances. We'd seen strange customers before, but there was something off about this guy, more than just a regular drifter. I asked Carl, "Doesn't he look familiar?" After a moment, I remembered. That guy had come in before, begging for food and a ride. We had to kick him out because he was bothering the customers. But now, something had changed. He looked panicked, like he had seen something terrifying. Carl just shook his head, muttering, "Here we go again." I looked at the bathroom door. I didn't want to check on him, but I didn't have much choice. Carl handed me the keys, nodding toward the bathroom. "Go check if he's all right." I knocked on the door, asking if he needed help, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing. I called out, fumbling with the keys. I pushed the door open, saying I was coming in. The bathroom was empty. No trace of the man. No dirt, no blood, nothing. The bathroom was as clean as the night before. I froze at the doorway. "End and year and ye and Andra." I screamed for Carl. He rushed over. I backed away as he pushed past me, staring into the spotless room with wide, disbelieving eyes. We stood behind the counter, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could he have disappeared? I looked at Carl, but he had the same horrified expression as I did. Then I saw movement near the front window. The man was outside, staring at us. His face was worse than before, bloody, swollen, and his eyes were bleeding. But what froze me in place was how his right hand hung limply at his side, looking like it was about to snap off. His thumb was sticking straight up, unnaturally stiff, as if he was trying to hitch a ride. Before I could grab the phone to call 911, a loud noise echoed from the back of the diner. Carl and I rushed to the back. It was coming from the freezer. Someone was tearing into the food boxes. Carl grabbed a knife from the counter, and we slowly moved in. The man was inside, tearing open a box of frozen meatballs and pressing a pile of meat against his arm, like he was possessed. But his arm, it wasn't right. His hand was dangled, almost detached from his wrist. For a moment, everything went still. We locked eyes on him, witnessing something we couldn't believe. Then, at an unnatural speed, he bolted past us, kicked the kitchen door open, and ran outside. Carl and I stood there, too shocked to react. We had just witnessed the impossible. Carl hurried to the front, locked the diner doors, and turned off the lights, plunging the place into darkness. The only light now came from the neon sign outside, casting a dim red glow on the counter. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. That man, if he was really injured, was moving with an unnatural speed and strength. And those eyes, it was like something else was controlling him. When I looked out the window, the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man. Carl stood with me, his face tense, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. I asked Carl what we should do now, and if we should call the police. Carl shook his head and said they wouldn't believe us, and there was no way to explain this. He reconsidered, slowly walking to the phone and picking up the receiver. But just as he dialed 911, the lights in the diner flickered. The hum of the refrigerator went silent, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, in the darkness, we heard a soft, slow tapping on the window. We bolted through the kitchen, with Carl leading the way. I glanced back just in time to see the glass shatter, and the man crawling through the window like a wild animal. Carl pushed open the back door, and we stumbled out into the alley behind the diner. Carl panted, glancing around. We need to get to the car. We sprinted down the alley, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. He was faster than I expected, his heavy breathing growing louder as he closed in on us. I could hear his raspy voice muttering something, words I couldn't quite make out. Carl reached the car, fumbling with the keys, urging me to get in quickly as the doors unlocked. I yanked the door open and jumped inside just as Carl started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the man standing at the end of the alley. Now he was covered in blood, his smile wider as he slowly raised his thumb again, rigid and grotesque, like a hitchhiker's signal. Tires screeched as Carl slammed on the gas, and the truck sped out of the alley and onto the road. I glanced into the rearview mirror, my heart still racing. The man stood motionless at the edge of the diner, watching us disappear into the night. We didn't speak for the first few miles, both of us too stunned to process what had just happened. We drove in silence for the next hour, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I eventually called the police to report the incident. To my surprise, they told us to head toward a location near the diner. They confirmed that a man matching that description had been reported. A man had been killed in a hit and run accident near the ramp, not far from the diner. As I got closer, I saw it. It was the same man. His body lay by the roadside, his clothes covered in dirt. But the eeriest part was his right hand, still holding that thumb up, just like before. According to the report, the man had survived the initial accident earlier that night and had been able to walk. His desperate search for help led him to our diner before he collapsed on the road. But there was more to the story. It turned out that this man had been involved in a series of violent incidents years earlier, hitchhiking across states and attacking those who picked him up. The police pieced together his history, a fugitive, infamous for attacking victims and vanishing into the night. The accident had broken his body, but it didn't kill him immediately. He had stumbled into the diner, seeking refuge, only to return to the streets, where he was eventually found dead. The police said he had been trying to use his injury to manipulate others. We were lucky to have escaped him. As I stood in the parking lot, staring at the diner, everything started to make sense. The man wasn't a ghost. He was real. Maybe he had finally paid the price in the same way he had hurt others on the road. That was where his twisted journey had come to an end. The cruise ship in room 105. 2 years ago, after days of hard work, I treated myself to a vacation. I had booked my holiday on a cruise ship, and my room was in cabin 105. I was informed that my cabin had bunk beds, so I would have to share the cabin with someone else. It was a bit inconvenient, but I thought it wouldn't be a problem. When I arrived, his belongings were there, a suitcase and a few clothes scattered around, but I didn't see him anywhere. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the cabin was a musty smell in the air. The room was cold, abnormally cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I brushed it aside, thinking it was just the sea air coming in through the vents. That night, I fell asleep in the bottom bunk, exhausted from the day's activities. I expected my roommate to return at any moment, but as I drifted off, the cabin remained quiet. At some point after midnight, I was jolted awake by a gentle noise from above. The top bunk creaked as if someone was shifting, and I assumed my roommate had finally returned and gone to bed. But then, I heard the noise again, a metallic clink. My eyes flew open. It was too dark to see anything, but I could hear footsteps moving toward the cabin door. A moment later, suddenly the door creaked open slowly, and I heard footsteps running down the hallway. Confused, I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Had my roommate come in and left without saying a word? The door remained ajar, gently swaying as the ship rocked with the waves. I got out of bed, walked over, and closed the door, the cold draft from the hallway sending chills down my spine. I looked up at the top bunk, the curtain drawn. The figure I had heard was gone, but there was something unsettling about the way the curtain hung, almost as if someone or something was still there, hiding behind it. When I woke up the next morning, the ship was gently swaying on the waves, but the cabin was freezing. The window was wide open, and the musty smell was worse than ever. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn, and my roommate was nowhere to be found. I hadn't heard a single sound or voice from him. I decided to talk to a staff member about the discomfort of the cabin. His name was Nicky. I began explaining the cold, the foul smell, and the strange occurrences from the night. He listened, but as soon as I mentioned cabin 105, his expression changed. He asked me with a pale face if I was in cabin 105. I answered, confused by his reaction, and asked what was wrong. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. Then, in a low voice, leaning in and whispering, "There's something wrong with that cabin. Every passenger who's ever stayed there has disappeared. They all fell overboard. No one knows why. We're not allowed to talk about it. They say it's cursed." Having said that, he quickly left, leaving me standing there, stunned in shock. That night, I returned to the cabin, trying to suppress my fear. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn tight, and the air was colder than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even though I hadn't seen my roommate since I arrived, I decided to pull the curtain back to see for myself. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I slowly pulled it back, hoping to find nothing. And indeed, there was nothing there, just an empty bed. The smell of the sea was now stronger, pungent and overwhelming. I could almost taste the salt on my tongue. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept in. The room plunged into darkness as the flickering lights finally went out. My heart raced in my chest, and I heard it again. The sound. It was the sound of gentle footsteps again, but this time, they didn't come from the hallway. They came from the top bunk. I turned around just as I heard the creak that seemed to echo throughout the room. My blood ran cold. I could barely make out the shape of something moving beneath the blanket on the top bunk, writhing like a mass, and I could see the blanket suddenly swell oddly as if something was growing underneath it. I stepped back in fear as a pale, dripping hand slid out from beneath the blanket. It wasn't a human hand. It was swollen, grayish, the fingers puffy and twisted. The smell of rotting seaweed filled the air. I screamed, bolting out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the deck. The cold night air hit me, and I leaned against the railing, trying to catch my breath. But when I looked up, the sight before me left me breathless. There, on the deck, was the shadow of a man. His body was pale and bloated, his clothes tattered and soaked. His hollow eyes stared at me, empty and soulless. I ran to one of the ship's staff, desperate to tell him what had happened. He listened, his expression serious, as he quietly said, "Cabin 105. I've heard the stories, but no one has ever seen what you have." He suggested that after his shift, he would come to the room with me to prove there was a reasonable explanation. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. The ship was full, and there was nowhere else for me to stay. He and I sat in the cabin, the door locked. We searched the room from top to bottom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. We had a glass of whiskey, trying to ease my tension. He began to tell me that the first time this happened was a month ago. The man in that cabin had issues. He had escaped from a mental hospital and booked a ticket for this cruise. They said he jumped overboard to end it all. But every passenger since then has seen something. Just then, as Nikki spoke, the window latch began to slowly turn, as if someone were on the other side. His face paled as the window opened on its own. The smell of the sea flooded the room, and the lights flickered once more. Something moved on the top bunk. Nikki stood up, eyes wide in fear at something on the bed. I turned around, my heart pounding. There, on the top bunk, was the figure of a pale, bloated man, soaked in seawater. His lifeless eyes stared down at us as he reached out his hand. Nikki rushed toward the door, but it was too late. The figure leaped off the bed, its cold, wet hands wrapping around his throat. He screamed, trying to break free, but it was too strong. It tightened, choking the life out of him. I grabbed the cross around my neck and held it up. It let out a scream of terror and released him, turning its deadly white eyes towards me. With one last desperate push, I flung the door open, and the figure rushed through, disappearing into the dark hallway. The figure seemed to dissolve into the night, its body sinking into the dark waters below. We stood on the deck, gasping for breath, the horror of what just happened sinking in. By morning, after witnessing everything, they had sealed off cabin 105. No one was allowed inside anymore. The ship continued its journey, but the horror lingered. Cabin 105 was cursed, and whatever haunted it would never truly disappear. Underground parking and mysterious people. I worked the night shift at an apartment complex downtown. The job seemed simple enough: monitor cameras, patrol, and ensure the building's security. The building was constructed in the late 60s, and its design left many vulnerable entry points in the parking garage. The association was concerned about security, especially with the occasional break-ins and homeless people finding shelter in the hidden corners of the basement. I had worked here for months, and every night I would check every nook and cranny. Most nights were quiet, normal, even boring. Until tonight. I walked through the dimly lit parking garage, my footsteps echoing. The place was a maze of dead spaces and blind spots. Too many places to hide. Too many areas the cameras couldn't see. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only parked cars and empty spaces. I always hated the door that led to a dead-end hallway. It was an isolated corridor that led nowhere, just a locked door that couldn't be opened from the inside, as if it held some history better left unknown. As I approached the door, it was wide open. A cold wave of fear washed over me. The door was supposed to be locked tight. I swept my flashlight down the narrow hallway. There was nothing, just an empty glass bottle lying on the ground. My anxiety spiked. The thought of stepping into the hallway made me uneasy. I didn't want to get trapped in there, especially knowing the door locked from the outside. But procedure is procedure. I had to follow it, and I couldn't just leave the bottle there. Reluctantly, I stepped inside. I moved toward the bottle, my flashlight reflecting off the cold gray walls. Each step felt heavier than the last. I bent down, picked up the bottle, and stood up. But then, the sound that chilled me to the bone, the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed to the door, panic rising in my chest, and grabbed the handle. It was locked. I pounded on the metal door, screaming for help, but the thick concrete walls swallowed my cries. My heart raced as I realized no one was coming. It was 3 a.m. and I was trapped. I tried my phone, no signal. The thick walls and metal door blocked everything. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I leaned against the cold wall, trying to calm myself down. The flashlight was my only lifeline in the stifling darkness. I switched it off to save the battery, but I could still hear echoes from somewhere. Then the sound of car alarms blared, one after the other. Whoever had locked me in was out there, doing whatever they wanted, smashing car doors, stealing whatever they could. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps. It was a miracle. Someone was out there, and I had to make them hear me. I pounded on the door with all my strength, shouting loudly. Finally, a deep, raspy voice answered from the other side, and after a moment, the lock clicked. The door opened, and I felt a wave of relief. A passerby, on their way to work early, had heard my banging. I thanked them profusely as I stumbled out of the hallway, my legs shaking, but my relief didn't last long. As I returned to the basement, chaos greeted me. Windows were shattered, glass littered the concrete floor. At least a dozen cars had been broken into, valuable items stolen. Whoever locked me in knew exactly what they were doing. They had silenced the alarms after each car was hit, leaving behind damage worth tens of thousands of dollars. My heart sank. I knew what was coming next. When the morning shift arrived and the residents discovered the theft, the police would be called, and I would be fired. Security had been breached under my watch, and though it wasn't my fault, I was the one held responsible. Weeks later, after I had quit, the mystery still haunted me. I replayed the events of that night over and over in my head. How did they know exactly where to trap me? How did they avoid the cameras so perfectly? No one was ever caught. The footage showed nothing, just me, doing my rounds. As I walked, I didn't see a thing. Maybe they knew the blind spots of the place too well. Months had passed, but tonight, that phone call pulled me back to the core of everything. I walked into the parking garage. I approached the dead-end hallway, my heart pounding harder with every step. The door was ajar. Just like that night, I could feel the weight of the past pressing on me, daring me to confront it. There was something I missed before. I stood at the entrance, staring, then cautiously moved forward as my senses sharpened. This time, I was ready for whatever I might face. No more running. Then I saw him. It was probably the man who trapped me. His gaunt face was pale and dirty, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood still, almost like a statue, as if he had been waiting for me all this time. A chill ran down my spine. The man wasn't a ghost or a specter, he was real. My voice trembled as I spoke. "Who are you? Why did you do this?" The man didn't move at first, but then, slowly, a twisted smile spread across his face, growing wider. He started walking toward me. He started saying something I didn't understand, talking about how I would soon see for myself the secret of this place, the truth I had been afraid of and running from. He said he wasn't just some random drifter that night, and that he had been here much longer than I thought. This building, this place, it wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a prison, and people like him, they were trapped inside. For a moment, his expression darkened. He told me that there are things in this world that feed on fear and suffering. And places like this, they are where they hunt. Now, he was part of its cycle. My mind raced as I tried to understand what he was saying. The truth hit me, and I realized this man wasn't just some random criminal. He was a victim of something much darker, something that had taken hold of him and was now trying to take me too. I stepped back, my heart pounding. "I'm not like you. I can still get out of this." His smile widened again, sinister and mocking. I turned, glancing at the door, thinking about running. I clenched my fists, took one last look at the man, then turned and sprinted toward the door. I could hear his laughter echoing behind me, filling the narrow hallway. I ran through the parking garage, then stopped. Standing there, in the darkness, was another figure, identical to the man in the hallway. I froze. This couldn't be happening. More figures appeared, stepping out from the shadows. Each one looked just like him, pale, gaunt. Maybe they weren't real, but they felt so real, their malicious energy surrounding me. I staggered. That man hadn't been lying. This place, this building, it was still alive. It had taken him, just as it had taken others before him. And now it was my turn. But I wasn't going to let that happen. With one last surge of strength, I got up and ran, not stopping until I was far away from the building, the figures fading into the night behind me. I didn't look back. Safe in my apartment, I sat in the dark, the truth of that night still sinking in. The man, the building. I had escaped, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be that simple. I needed to stay far away from that place and never go back. The stalker in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot. It was just an ordinary morning. My usual routine. A quick coffee stop at Dunkin' Donuts before heading to work. I don't go there every day, only when I feel like treating myself. Today, I decided to visit my usual spot. The store was busy, as expected, with the familiar noise of orders and chatter filling the space. I lined up, placed my order, and within minutes, I had my coffee in hand. As I stepped out of Dunkin', the sun was high, and the parking lot was crowded. People were rushing off to work, grabbing breakfast, nothing unusual, except for one thing. There was a man standing near my car. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, near the passenger seat, wearing a black coat, with his head slightly tilted as if listening to something. I tried not to think too much about it. People do weird things sometimes, right? Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I pressed the unlock button on my remote, the faint beep cutting through the quiet, and I headed for the driver's seat. The plan was simple. Get in, start the car, drive off, and forget about it. As soon as I got inside, an uneasy feeling ran down my spine. I put the key in the ignition, and just as I was about to start the car, the passenger door opened. The man got in. For a second, I just stared, frozen in disbelief. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring out the window. My heart raced. I didn't understand what was happening. I turned to him, my voice shaky. I think you're in the wrong car. Silence. He didn't even acknowledge me. The tension was palpable. I said it again, louder this time. You're in the wrong car. Still nothing. He just stared out the window, his expression blank, detached. That's when the fear set in. I told him to get out or I'd call the police. My voice was firmer now, desperate. And then it happened. Without warning, he turned toward me, glaring. His hand shot toward the ignition, and before I could react, he grabbed my keys. For a moment, we struggled. He held my keys in a tight grip, and before I knew what was happening, he swung at me, using the keys as a weapon. He swung it toward my face. I dodged, but I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed open the driver's door and bolted. I ran, gasping, panicking, not stopping until I was back inside Dunkin' Donuts. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to explain what had just happened. Through the large glass windows of the store, I saw him driving off in my car, disappearing down the street. The next few minutes were a blur. The police arrived, took my statement, and I filled out a report, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. A few hours later, I received news. The police discovered my car by the woods in an empty state, and no one was in it. But something felt off. Even after I got my car back, the image of him sitting silently in the passenger seat, his vacant expression, lingered in my mind. Who was he? Why had he chosen my car? Weeks had passed since that strange man entered my car, and every visit to Dunkin' Donuts filled me with discomfort. Today was no different. I stood in line, ordered my coffee, and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, that he wouldn't come back. It was early evening when I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside. I scanned the area, my eyes instantly locking onto a familiar figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was him. This time, he didn't have that vacant look. Instead, he stood there, head tilted, grinning eerily and waving at me as if teasing. A chill ran down my spine. My heart raced in my chest as I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Somehow, he didn't chase after me. Instead, he casually opened the passenger door and sat back inside my car with that same blank expression. This time, he didn't drive away. He just sat there, staring at me through the windshield as if waiting for something. I began to call the police. They arrived within minutes. I stepped aside, watching them cautiously approach the vehicle. The man remained still. He sat there, his emotionless eyes fixed ahead, oblivious to the events unfolding around him. One of the officers commanded him to step out of the car. For a moment, it seemed like he ignored their orders. But then, he slowly turned his head, his expression oddly calm. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, raising his hands as if surrendering. A few hours later, I sat in the police station, recounting the incident as if it was the 100th time. My arm still throbbed with old bandages covering the cuts from the key. They told me he had been arrested, and after taking his fingerprints, they discovered he had a long history of mental illness. His records showed he had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His delusions had worsened over time, and it seemed he had fixated on me for reasons no one could explain. They said he saw things, heard voices screaming incoherently when there was nothing around. They believed he couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with sadness. The man who had terrorized me was not just a criminal. He was sick. His mind had warped reality into something unrecognizable, and I had become part of that nightmare. As I left the police station, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in my car, staring out the window, detached from the world. He had been arrested, and the officers assured me he would be taken back to a mental facility where he could receive the treatment he desperately needed. but the scars he left, both physical and mental, would take much longer to heal. I stood next to the car, hesitating to open the door, reluctant to sit in the driver's seat where everything had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to unlock the door and get into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove out of the parking lot, determined to move forward. After all, everything was finally over. Strange man in the cemetery. This summer, my family decided to go camping in a suburban village, a place where every corner seemed to hold a mysterious story. The locals were always whispering, especially about the nearby forest. But what intrigued me the most was the cemetery within the forest. No one had ever gone there after dark. We were not allowed to go there either. My cousin had the idea to play hide and seek at night. He liked to break boundaries, challenging all of us to venture into the forbidden forest. I went with my younger sister, who was only 10 at the time, and my cousin. He confidently decided to help us hide. I should have known it was a bad idea the moment he mentioned the cemetery. We crept through the forest, the leaves crunching underfoot. The closer we got to the cemetery, the colder the air became. Even the stray dogs that had been barking earlier were now completely silent. A sense of fear and unease flooded over me. My little sister held my hand tightly. But then, in the eerie silence, a sound pierced the air, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up, the unmistakable sound of digging. Out of the darkness, we saw him, a disheveled old man in filthy clothes, hunched over a grave. He was digging with his bare hands, muttering something incomprehensible. My eyes followed his hand. I saw something pale, like a stiff hand, sticking out of the freshly dug earth. None of us dared to move for a moment. My cousin was the first to act. He slowly pulled us back, whispering that we had to leave, that we needed to move silently. The man bent down again, this time pulling away more earth, revealing more of an arm, a foot, a body. Then he dragged out several small plastic bags and laid them on the ground. My sister trembled, and we were slowly sneaking away. Then I accidentally stepped on a branch. My heart skipped a beat, knowing that sound might give us away. He slowly raised his head, turned to us, and said,
You shouldn't be here.
Then he stared at us and gave a slow, creepy smile as if he had lost his mind. The man laughed maniacally, wiping his dirty hands on his pants. Then he took a step forward, his bare feet dragging across the ground.
You kids want to know what's down here?
Before I could react, my cousin scooped up my sister, pulling her into his arms. The man's voice taunted us, as if daring us.
See what they're hiding in the ground.
I stumbled, frozen. My cousin yanked on my arm, snapping me back to reality. He yelled, "Run!" and we bolted away from the cemetery. I ran as if my life depended on it. I could hear him behind us, his feet scraping on the gravel, his wheezing breath growing closer. I didn't dare stop. My cousin pulled us forward, his grip tight, until we reached the cemetery gate. We burst through the gate. For some reason, the man had stopped. He was no longer chasing us. He didn't follow, just stood there, watching. Then, as if he had never been there, he turned around and disappeared into the darkness of the cemetery. We returned to the campsite. No one said a word or mentioned what had happened. The next day, we found out that the old man had been arrested by the police. He was a deranged criminal who had been desecrating graves to smuggle drugs across the border. That night, we felt truly lucky. I still wonder what would have happened if he had been younger, stronger, faster. We never went near that forest again and reminded ourselves never to ignore warnings and restrictions again. Abandoned McDonald's. For the past few weeks, I had been planning a vlog to explore and uncover the rumors surrounding an abandoned McDonald's that had been circulating for years, stories of massacres and unsolved crimes. Today, I finally made it here. As I drove towards it, My hands trembled with excitement, though the thought of experiencing it was pretty terrifying. But I believed that if this video went live, it would break all records on my channel. I arrived. It was truly an abandoned store, with peeling paint and dust-caked, grimy windows, giving it a very eerie feel. I took a deep breath and prepared to step through the door to explore. Inside, everything was eerily silent. The floor was dotted with patches of mold. The tables and chairs were arranged neatly, but covered with a thick layer of dust. I scanned my camera over the dining area, trying to capture every detail. The old menu was still there, faded and barely legible, just like the posters on the wall, all rotting from years of abandonment. I made my way towards the kitchen. Familiar machines like the ice cream maker and deep fryers were still there, but none of them were intact, all rusted beyond repair. Behind the counter, there was a large black mold patch on the floor. It sent shivers down my spine, as if someone had lain there for so long that their body had decomposed into the floor. I had heard rumors that the police once found a body here. I moved forward, trying to ignore the growing unease within me. I headed towards the restroom, just as my flashlight began to flicker. Suddenly, I felt something, a figure behind me. Startled, I turned around, only to see a Ronald McDonald statue grinning back at me. It didn't look anything like I remembered from my childhood. I forced a nervous laugh. I told myself it was just a statue, nothing to worry about. I continued, leaving the strange figure behind, heading towards the restroom. As I reached the restroom door, a musty smell hit my nose, but I pushed the door open anyway. I wanted to confirm a rumor that a killer had hidden a body here. I didn't know if it was true. I walked inside. There wasn't anything too unusual, just an old restroom, fairly spacious, covered in spots of stubborn moss. I felt a small sense of relief. I began panning the camera around every corner of the restroom. Maybe this place wasn't haunted like everyone said. In the end, rumors were just rumors. I left the room, but I couldn't shake off a strange feeling like I wasn't the only one here. My eyes darted to the floor, and I noticed dark stains that I hadn't seen before. I moved closer to capture them clearly on camera. Suddenly, I tripped, dropping the camera. As I bent down to pick it up, instinctively, I looked up and saw a horrifying sight right before my eyes. Hanging from the ceiling, there was a body suspended in the air, the red uniform with the unmistakable golden arches. It was a McDonald's employee. Her face was gaunt, her eye sockets empty and black, with long hair and arms swaying loosely from the ceiling. I needed to get out. My hands shook as I scrambled to grab my camera as quickly as possible. I had to leave, and fast. Now I believed the rumors were true. This place was haunted, cursed. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found a police station. I told them everything, handed over my camera, and waited for them to investigate. When the police searched the restaurant, they found nothing. But what about the footage on my camera? I reviewed all the footage of the restaurant, the kitchen, the restroom, everything was there. But when it got to the part with the Ronald McDonald statue, there was no statue at all. The terrifying scenes I had witnessed, none of it was in the video. I was left speechless, with no explanation. The mystery of the dolls. Her name is Mari. She was on her way to Manor Street, covered in thick fog. Siri's voice alerted, "You have arrived at your destination." The silhouette of the mansion slowly emerged from the fog. Perched on a hill, surrounded by strange 18th century architecture, it looked like something from a nightmare, making her uneasy. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way. The Coopers were an old, wealthy family, and tonight, she was babysitting their 10-year-old daughter. Mrs. Cooper had explained over the phone that their regular babysitter had an emergency and they were willing to pay her triple her usual rate. The offer was too generous to refuse. As soon as she stepped in, Mrs. Cooper, a pale and frail woman, greeted her on the porch with a forced smile. She told her, "Bridget is upstairs. I've left instructions on the table. Please, don't bother her too much." Mrs. Cooper kept glancing around, as if there was something she couldn't tell Mari. Mari walked down the dark, seemingly endless hallway. She followed the instructions left for her, leading to the room at the end of the corridor. When she entered, she saw Bridget sitting in the middle of the room. Her large black eyes seemed too old for her face. She was clutching a porcelain doll, its face eerily lifelike. She greeted Bridget, but Bridget remained silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. The room was filled with dolls, porcelain faces, shiny hair, all meticulously arranged around the room. Mari shuddered at how real their hair looked. She tried to engage Bridget with stories and games, but the girl remained eerily silent. Hours passed in strange silence until finally, around 10 p.m., Bridget said she was sleepy. Mari led Bridget to the bedroom, and that's when she noticed something was wrong. The girl began moving toward the dolls, saying, "They are my slaves." She could hardly believe her ears. She never expected something like that to come from a child. She knew she needed to keep a closer eye on the girl. By 2 a.m., she had dozed off on the couch. A sudden noise startled her awake. She groggily rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything, when she realized someone was standing behind her. She thought it was Bridget. She couldn't believe her eyes. The girl's face was twisted, her features deformed, aging grotesquely. She clutched the doll tightly in her hands and muttered, "I like your eyes. I will have them." Fear gripped her as Bridget lunged at her with an unnatural strength for a child. She fell to the floor, the weight of Bridget's small body pinning her down. She screamed in vain as Bree's hands scratched her face. "I will take your eyes," Bridget hissed, her voice rasping as if it belonged to someone else. The girl began pulling at a handful of her hair wildly, gleefully. With all her strength, she shoved the child off. She ran down the long hallway, glancing back to see Bridget enraged, chasing her madly. In desperation, she grabbed a decorative figure from a side table and hurled it at Bridget. It struck her forehead, and Bridget screamed in pain, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She ran until she burst through the front door, flagging down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by her disheveled appearance, helped her get to the nearest police station. When she returned to the mansion with the police, the truth revealed was more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Bridget wasn't a little girl. The woman she had been babysitting was a dwarf, Mrs. C., Cooper's deformed sister, whose body never grew but whose mind had twisted into something monstrous over the years. She often comes to the mansion, kills them in their sleep, and collects what she likes. But what she likes the most is their hair. She will use it to make dolls. The police uncovered 7 bodies in the backyard, all young women, all missing their hair. The porcelain dolls in Bridget's room were adorned with their scalps, their hair meticulously attached to the dolls she called her slaves. Mrs. Cooper had been covering up her sister's crimes for years, burying the bodies and protecting her in some inexplicable way. The police arrested both women. She now sat in her small apartment, still haunted by the events of that night. She no longer babysat, and just the sight of a doll made her heart race. The memory of Bridget still haunted her dreams.